The chair will now recognize herself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. I want to thank our panel so much for being here, both of our panels, and for our members for being here. I want to tell you that consumer protection is my passion and what really first drew me to public life, as many members will recall. I like to call our subcommittee the nation's legislative helpline. And now, nowhere is there more evidence of this in its oversight of the Consumer Product Safety Commission. The fundamental questions that we must answer today is found in the hearing's title. Is the Consumer Product Safety Commission fulfilling its mission to protect consumers? Unfortunately for consumers, the data doesn't suggest that the CPSC is doing all it can to fulfill its mission. CPSC's ability to protect consumers from unsafe products relies on its ability to conduct effective and efficient investigations and issue recalls. However, over the last 3 years, the CPSC recall actions have slowed dramatically. In 2016, when Commissioner Kaye was serving as chairman, the Commission issued 332 recalls. Since then, that number has sunk pretty precipitously, as last year there were only 258 recalls issued. Now, don't misunderstand me. I would love to believe that the decrease in the recalls was a result of more effective regulation and higher quality safety products, safer products being brought to the market. The reality is, however, a survey conducted by Kids in Danger revealed that the number of incident reports in children's products actually increased over that time, which suggests that the CPSC is moving slowly to open cases and to recall unsafe products, or worse, not moving much at all. All of this comes as many of these products are becoming more and more complex, with new challenges for the agency to tackle. For example, last year, every Christmas we have an unsafe toys demonstration, and for the first time we talked about connected toys, those that may track our children wherever they go. I commend Chairman Buerkle for making statements in support of increased resources for the Commission. I'm checking my time. Good. In particular, a proposed initiative to gather information from urgent care centers in addition to emergency rooms, and including e-commerce platforms in its marketplace analysis. However, in its budget request, the Consumer Product Safety Commission did not seek an increase, meaning that this and other plans and initiatives would remain pipe dreams. I look forward to hearing from Chairman Buerkle and the other commissioners. I thank you all for being here. It means so much to us as we discuss these and other important issues facing consumers. I'm also delighted to hear from consumer groups in our second panel. Their voice is so very important, and it's been missing, I think, unfortunately, in the last few years on this subcommittee. I look forward to working with each of you and on the important issues that the Commission deals with. My preference will always be to be able to work in collaboration with the CPSC and all the members of this subcommittee on both sides of the aisle. I hope the commissioners will stay for the second panel. I really want to invite you to do that, where we will hear from advocates about how furniture tip-overs kill one child every 2 weeks, how bed rails can kill senior citizens, and the need for flame mitigation devices on portable fuel containers. There are so many things that we can be doing to make the marketplace safer, and this is the subcommittee that actually can do that. We look forward to working in collaboration. And now I yield to Ranking Member Cathy McMorris Rodgers for 5 minutes.
Good morning, and I thank the chair for yielding. Welcome to the Consumer Protection and Commerce Subcommittee hearing with the Consumer Product Safety Commission. It's great to see everyone. Thank you to Acting Chair Anne-Marie Buerkle, my former colleague, our former colleague, as well as the commissioners Biacco, Feldman, Kay, and Alder, all for being here today to discuss the Commission's mission and important work. Even though it's only been 6 months with all 5 of you at the Commission, I'm looking forward to hearing directly from you. I'll begin by congratulating my good friend and former colleague, Chair Buerkle, for advancing through the Senate Commerce Committee last week. My hope is the Senate will act swiftly to confirm you as chair of the Commission. Constitutional concerns with agency action prior to your nomination and the delays with your nomination clearly demonstrate why your confirmation and leadership are so needed at the agency. Chair Buerkle, you have been steadfast in your efforts to advance the safety mission of the agency, even when you spent the majority of the last 2 years in the minority at the Commission. I'd like to ensure you have time this morning to address some recent questioning of your motives and your leadership at the Commission. As a nurse, lawyer, mother, and grandmother, I know how important safety is to you and your career in public service. It's apparent that some are still trying to delay or halt your confirmation in the Senate because by law, you're required to leave the Commission in October if you've not been confirmed. That would leave the Commission at a deadlock, 2-2, only increasing uncertainty. Why that would be anyone's goal with an agency as important as the CPSC is beyond me. I urge the Senate to advance your confirmation as soon as possible. I want you to know your hard work and dedication to protect Americans has not gone unnoticed. The Consumer Product Safety Commission, or CPSC, was established in 1972. The Commission is charged with protecting the public against unreasonable risk of injuries and deaths associated with consumer products. The CPSC's jurisdiction covers over 15,000 products that are sold to and used every day in our homes, our schools, businesses, and elsewhere. However, the CPSC does not have jurisdiction over tobacco products, motor vehicles, aircrafts, boats, food, drugs, and the like. The CPSC's primary functions are to develop voluntary standards with industry or create mandatory standards where no adequate voluntary standard exists, to organize recalls of dangerous products that pose a risk to people, and to investigate potentially hazardous products. The structure of the statute is critical. It recognizes the importance of the agency having open lines of communication with the sectors of our economy that they regulate. When something does go wrong, there are processes in place that take products off the shelves or websites as quickly as possible. This is why members of this committee have been such strong supporters of the Fast Track Recall Program as one example. The work you have done and your staff do is so important. I look forward to our discussion here today, and I thank you all for being here. I yield back.
And now I'm proud to yield 5 minutes to the chair of the full committee, Frank Pallone.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Few people have heard of the Consumer Product Safety Commission, but it serves a critical role in protecting consumers from dangerous products. It's the agency that makes sure your coffee maker does not burn down your house, your baby does not die from a defective crib, your power drill doesn't electrocute you, your hot water heater does not poison you, your child's toy is not made of lead, etc. And these are real examples of defective products that have been recalled, and they demonstrate the important role the Commission should play in protecting consumers. In order to be fully effective, CPSC needs to be a proactive agency, not a reactive one. But unfortunately, I'm concerned that CPSC has become an inactive agency. The fact is that CPSC is issuing fewer recalls than in years past, it's issuing fewer safety standards, and it's imposing fewer and smaller penalties. The marketplace hasn't suddenly become safer, as our second panel will attest. Instead, CPSC's inaction comes from the top, and it leaves me wondering how many more dangerous products are out there, and what, if anything, is being done by the Commission to prevent further deaths and injuries. Inaction is simply not acceptable, but Acting Chairman Burkle seems to be pushing just that after stating that one of her top priorities was, I quote, reducing regulatory burdens. And she voted against imposing safety standards for infant slings, table saws, magnet sets, and portable generators. And she also voiced her opposition to civil penalties and her hope that CPSC would not impose them. So this is not a record that puts consumers' safety first, in my opinion. But again, it seems that's not the priority of the acting chairman. She's been true to her word to reduce regulatory burdens. Under Acting Chairman Burkle, CPSC has also failed to hold corporations accountable for selling hazardous products, at times even working with industry to, in my opinion, sabotage the agency's own efforts to save lives. Under previous leadership, the CPSC began a rulemaking on portable generator safety, including standards for carbon monoxide emissions that result in an average of 73 deaths per year. But after industry lobbyists convinced former EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt to assert jurisdiction over carbon monoxide emissions, the acting chairman Burkle sided with the EPA and industry to stop the rulemaking. And as of today, the EPA has taken no action, and people continue to die. Now, when consumers complained that a defective wheel in Tax strollers was causing serious injuries, CPSC sued, seeking a recall over the objections of then Commissioner Burkle. After 2 Republican commissioners joined CPSC, they voted to settle the litigation on terms favorable to the company, not to consumers. And the settlement did not even call the needed repair or recall, leaving parents confused and children at risk. The trend of favoring industry over consumers is troubling, and I want to hear from the commissioners and consumer advocates about the direction that the Commission is headed. I also want to hear about CPSC's actions on an array of specific hazards. 3 years ago, I helped pass the Child Nicotine Poisoning Prevention Act, requiring child-proof packaging for liquid nicotine containers. Those can kill children if ingested, and I'm hearing that CPSC is not doing enough to keep these deadly products out of children's hands. I'm also disappointed that the Commission voted against beginning a rulemaking on children's dressers last month, and I would like to know what CPSC is doing to prevent deadly furniture tip-overs, which Chairman Schakowsky has been calling attention to for years. I also want to know about CPSC's efforts to ensure the safety of sleeping infants and how it's incorporating pediatricians' advice into its evaluation of inclined sleepers and crib bumpers. Consumer advocates have argued that these products are inherently dangerous and should be banned, that they're still for sale at baby stores and online. And despite several deaths associated with inclined sleepers, CPSC wouldn't name a specific product until days before this hearing. So it shouldn't take a congressional hearing to get CPSC to do its job and prevent babies from dying. And I continue to have concerns about e-commerce sites letting unsafe counterfeit products be shipped directly to consumers' front doors. These products have no testing or quality control and are a growing danger. So as you can see, there's a long list of dangerous products that remain on the market because CPSC has failed to do its job. It's long past time this committee conduct oversight of the CPSC and bring attention to these many product safety concerns. So I want to thank the chairwoman for having this hearing. And you've been talking about these for long before you were the chair, and now finally have an opportunity to do some good oversight, and I appreciate that. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. I appreciate your comment. And now I would like to recognize Mr. Walden, the ranking member of the full committee, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Well, good morning, Madam Chair, and thanks for having the hearing today with the Consumer Product Safety Commission. I especially want to extend a warm welcome to our former colleague and friend, current acting chair of the CPSC, Anne-Marie Burkle. It's good to see you again. Hopefully your recent third vote of confidence by the Senate Commerce Committee will be the charm, and your confirmation will move swiftly through the United States Senate. In her short time as acting chair, Ms. Burkle has put consumer safety first. Under her leadership, the Commission has, among other items, implemented or revised more than 12 safety standards, helped improve window covering safety, pushed industry to utilize flow restrictions on liquid nicotine packaging to improve safety and reduce risks to children, and has secured tens of millions of dollars in civil penalties against bad actors. I want to thank you for your work, and I look forward to your continued commitment to safety as you continue on as our confirmed chair. The CPSC is a critical safety agency that must have clear leadership. There are significant constitutional questions with respect to actions taken by the CPSC in the absence of such leadership from President Trump's inauguration through the fall of 2017. During that time, the agency consisted of only one Republican commissioner, Acting Chair Burkle, to 3 Democrat commissioners, and such questions may require the agency to divert resources needed to fulfill its safety mission to deal with potential legal challenges. It's imperative that the CPSC's process actually works to protect consumers and not lead to expensive and unneeded litigation. CPSC must rely on up-to-date, scientifically sound data to base its decisions and not prejudge or litigate in the court of public opinion. I'm encouraged the agency is turning the corner with respect to these issues under Acting Chair Burkle's leadership. CPSC protects consumers from unreasonable risks, and we know there are a lot of them out there, and against hazards from consumer products by working with industry to establish, in many cases, voluntary or industry-based standards, by developing mandatory standards where industry-based standards are not sufficient, and through recalls. Given the size of the CSPC and the breadth of your jurisdiction, Congress had the foresight to encourage the CSPC to engage industry to carry out its mission in a bipartisan effort, I might add. However, some are attempting to discredit the open lines of communication between the agency and regulated industries. But shouldn't our goal be to protect consumers in the most efficient manner possible? Having an open dialogue and an open line of communication with industry actually helps the CPSC solve problems earlier and protect consumers better. We must continue encouraging the CPSC to engage industry and in-the-field experts on complex issues. With consumer products, industry can provide unique expertise and insights into what's happening in the marketplace and can help identify potential harms. So it's no secret that bureaucratic government agencies do not move fast. Yet, because of industry's willingness to work with CSPC, programs like the Fast Track Recall Program, Retailer Reporting Program, and the Small Business Regulatory Robot are now up and running. Cutting industry completely out of the process would benefit no one and would just increase the risk of keeping dangerous products potentially in the market longer. The bottom line is that CPSC does important work to help protect children and consumers by working with all stakeholders, and safety remains the Commission's priority, as it should. So I thank you all for being here. I thank you all for your service in this capacity. I know there's a lot on your plate, and you heard a few more items from up here on the dais. So I look forward to hearing more about CPSC's agenda and its efforts to protect consumers. If anyone else wants the remainder of my time, I yield to the ranking member of the Health Subcommittee, Dr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Walden. And I just also wanted to welcome our former colleague, Ms. Burkle. You've been good enough to come and talk to me on several of the issues that have occurred when I was chairman of this subcommittee several years ago. And Commissioner Kaye, I certainly appreciate the time you invested in making the fireworks demonstration available to members of the subcommittee and staff. I don't remember exactly where it was, but it was way on the sticks. And you did a great job with demonstrating the rigors that you go through to ensure that fireworks products are indeed safe. So thanks all to the commissioners for being here, and I'll yield back to the ranking member.
The gentleman yields back. The chair would like to remind members that pursuant to committee rules, all members' written opening statements shall be made part of the record. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our first panel of witnesses for today's hearing from the Consumer Product Safety Commission. Again, it's such an honor that all of you would show up this morning. Thank you. I'll go through all of them, all of you first. Commissioner Robert Adler, Commissioner Dana Bialko. Am I saying it right? Bialko. Okay, Bialko. Acting Chairwoman Anne Marie Burkle, Commissioner Peter Feldman, and Commissioner Elliott Kaye. We want to thank all the witnesses for joining us today. We look forward to your testimony. At this time, the chair will now recognize each witness for 5 minutes. You have all had experience, I think, with the lights, to provide an opening statement. So we're actually going to move in alphabetical order, and we'll begin with a statement from Commissioner Adler, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman. Is this on? and Ranking Member Rogers, and the members of the Subcommittee on Consumer Protection and Commerce. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I'm pleased to be here to discuss an agency that I've been associated with in some fashion since it opened in 1973, and where I've been a commissioner since August 2009. At the outset, I would point out that CPSC is far and away the smallest of the federal health and safety agencies, with a current funding level of $127 million and a staff of 539 FTEs. And I want to put our budget in perspective. I note that we have a sister agency, FDA. They recently asked for an increase in their budget that's 5 times the size of our entire budget. Notwithstanding our modest budget, our jurisdictional scope is extremely wide, encompassing roughly 15,000 categories of consumer products found in homes, stores, schools, and recreational settings. This October is going to mark the 47th anniversary of the passage of this landmark piece of legislation. Looking back, I think Congress and the agency should take great pride in what the agency's accomplished. I can't go through all the accomplishments, but I did want to focus, at least for a moment, on the dramatic drop in death and injuries to children. Here are just a few statistics. There's been an over an 80% drop in childhood fatal poisonings, 70% drop in crib deaths, almost 90% reduction in baby walker injuries, and an almost complete elimination of childhood suffocations in abandoned refrigerators. We've also seen dramatic drops in fatal electrocutions, residential fire deaths, and traumatic injuries from lawnmowers. In short, I think we offer an excellent return on investment. I'd also like to mention the tremendous strides we've taken to enforce and implement the Consumer Product Safety Improvement Act of 2008 since its passage about 10 years ago. And here I have to pause and thank Chairman Schakowsky for the critical role she played in the passage of that piece of legislation. Among the actions we've taken, enforcing stringent limits on lead and phthalates in children's products, promulgating the strongest safety standard in the world for cribs, writing and continuing to write a series of standards, I believe the count is now 20, for durable infant products such as play yards and strollers. I am thrilled with our implementation of the Consumer Product Safety Improvement Act. I wish I could share that same degree of pride when it comes to our other pieces of legislation, but I think there's a broad disconnect between the effectiveness of our rulemaking under CPSIA and under the other acts we enforce, and I'm going to briefly explain. When we were first established in 1973, we promulgated numerous critical safety rules dealing with hazards such as flammable children's sleepwear, dangerously shattering glass panes, and unsafe toys under the traditional rulemaking procedures in the Administrative Procedure Act. I did a count. By my count, the agency wrote 24 safety rules in its first 8 years. That's about 3 a year. In 1981, however, Congress imposed a cumbersome set of procedures on the agency that have hampered our rulemaking in the years since. And I did another count. It's been 38 years since 1981. We have managed to eke out 10 safety rules under these revised procedures. So that's only about 1 every 3.5 years. What's even greater concern to me is we've only written 1 safety standard under these procedures in the past 10 years. To be blunt, I have little doubt that lives have been lost and injuries incurred unnecessarily because of these delays in our rulemaking, and with no particular improvement in the quality of the standards we write. While I'm discussing features of the Consumer Product Safety Act that I'd like to see reformed, I must also mention an onerous restriction on information disclosure under which CPSC alone among all federal agencies must operate, and I refer to the provisions of Section 6B of the Consumer Product Safety Act. Unlike any other Health and Safety Act agency, when we receive a request for information in our files under the Freedom of Information Act, we can't simply disclose that if it would allow the public to determine the name of a manufacturer. In that case, we must send the information to the manufacturer, wait for comments from the manufacturer, process the manufacturer's comments, and then and only then make a decision about whether we would release that information. All of this done, I might add, with the looming prospect of being sued if the company doesn't like what we're about to disclose. And here's what's particularly frustrating about this provision. It applies to information where we're simply a repository. We're simply acting as a library. We didn't generate the information ourselves. So if we got a request for a list of 50 names of manufacturers of widgets. In order to release that list, we'd have to send out 50 separate notices with 49 names redacted before we could proceed to release that information. That is costly, both in terms of time and in resources at the agency. One quick final point, I'd like to share a concern that I have with an often vulnerable group of which I am a proud member, senior citizens. We are one of the fastest growing demographics in the country. In fact, by 2030, 1 in 5 people in this country will be age 65 or older. We are living healthier, and we need to make sure we are living safer. Have I gone over my time? Well, I apologize for that, and I will be. Just a few additional words about senior citizens, but I can withhold. Thank you.
And next, Commissioner, if you could move your name tag in front so we could all see that. There we go. Commissioner Baiocco, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, and good morning, Chairman Schakowsky, Ranking Member McMorris-Rodgers, and members of the House Subcommittee on Consumer Protection and Commerce. Thank you for inviting me here today and for providing all of the commissioners the opportunity to testify before you today. This is the first time I've appeared before Congress, and I believe that it is essential and it is a great responsibility that we discuss the status of the agency, and also I'd like to share with you my individual perspectives, goals, and ideas for making the agency successful. While I've only been at the agency for about 10 months, it has been an honor to work with my fellow commissioners to facilitate our statutory directives and to also explore ways to keep the agency current, as current as possible, with all of the different types of products and the ever-evolving issues that are associated with the consumer product safety world. The enormity of the agency's charge cannot be overstated. In the title to this hearing, you asked, is the Consumer Product Safety Commission fulfilling its mission? The answer is yes. In fact, during my short tenure, the agency has taken several safety-related actions, including the vigorous enforcement of the Child Nicotine Poisoning Prevention Act of 2015. We have finalized safety rules for high chairs, baby changing products, booster seats, portable hook-on chairs. We have voted to ensure that a mandatory standard to address furniture tip-overs is finalized. And we have developed and released a CPSC recall app to better inform consumers about recalled products. We have expanded our safety collaboration with retail outlets, trade organizations, and consumer advocacy groups as it pertains to toys. And the agency's new and progressive social media campaign is extremely well received. However, given the great mission before us, I believe that the agency can and must do more. First, we must enhance the agency as a whole to better serve consumers. To do this, the agency must commit to forward-looking investments that will make the agency more efficient, more nimble, and more effective. For example, the agency should invest smartly in 3 basic upgrades. Improved equipment is one. Additional and specialized personnel to revamp and oversee the agency's technology, data capabilities, and hazard identification systems. And third, a more robust plan for testing and studying new trends, products, and impending issues. Merely redecorating an outdated system does not now and will not in the future allow the agency to serve the American public in the manner in which they deserve. Given the speed with which new products enter the marketplace every day, the ease with which they get directly into a consumer's home, and the complexity of the global supply chain, which includes products that do not comply with our safety rules and standards, real action must be taken to keep the agency relevant. We must end the cyclical exercise of patching an already obsolete system that becomes more antiquated every day. We must ensure that a generous portion of the agency's budget, whatever it may be, is dedicated to transitioning the CPSC into a forward-looking agency rather than a reactive one. We must provide our engineers with reliable and sound data to address and solve product hazards. Second, the agency must be purposeful in its regulatory activities. Rulemaking, of course, is a key charge of the CPSC's mission, and there are strict statutory directives that we must follow. However, the agency must do a better job with this authority. For example, when an agency is promulgating a safety rule, it should do so swiftly and decisively. It must be legally sound and there must be a scientific reason to do so. It serves no purpose to force a rule that does not solve the hazard or that leaves room for legal challenge because the rule lacks basis in data, science, or proper procedure. All agency legal actions must be credible, rationally related to the hazard before it, and consistent with the rule of law. Third, the CPSC should be the gold standard in engineering, testing, and problem solving. We must allow our engineers to be independent and solution-oriented. Our entire team must be empowered to solve product hazards affirmatively when appropriate, rather than be encouraged to merely opine on a proposed solution offered by interested stakeholders. Finally, I think it's imperative that the agency implement programs to allow it to move ahead of the curve on emerging trends and impending issues. To illustrate, the marketplace is currently demanding the production of more sustainable products, however that word is defined. To the extent sustainable means recycled or reusable products, the agency must ensure that the market demand does not indirectly undo safety advancements that the agency has worked long and hard to accomplish. The agency should be studying now, not reacting later, to any of these potential pitfalls. Since joining the CPSC, I've been working on some individual initiatives to contribute to the agency's mission. One of those focuses on counterfeit products, because that is a deep pool of non-compliant products. I'm very impressed with the work that the agency's import surveillance team is doing on this initiative. They have developed excellent relationships with their custom and border control
Commissioner,
colleagues.
you're going to have to wrap it up.
Oh, I'm sorry. My overarching goal as a commissioner is to ensure that the CPSC is employing the best practices in all that we do. I have requested that the Commission conduct an internal review of the agency staff directives and procedures to identify and enhance areas that need improvement. That review, in my opinion, is critical to the integrity of the agency. If we have additional questions beyond today, I'm available anytime to answer them. Thank you for the extra time.
I thank you, and Acting Chairwoman Burkle, it's yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Chairman Schakowsky, Ranking Member McMorris Rogers, and distinguished members of this committee. Thank you for holding today's hearing on the Consumer Product Safety Commission. I had the honor of serving alongside the chairwoman and the ranking member and some of the subcommittee's members during my time in the House of Representatives, and I'm so very glad to be back on Capitol Hill to discuss the very important work of the Consumer Product Safety Commission. I also appreciate the productive meetings with the chairwoman and the ranking member earlier this year. I hope today's hearing is another step towards a collaborative relationship with the committee. I'm so pleased to be joined by all of my colleagues today. We are a different composition of commissioners since the last time we sat before this subcommittee, but we have the very same mission of keeping consumers safe. Additionally, I want to highlight CPSC's dedicated staff. CPSC consists of an elite group of professionals who work hard every day and are committed to keeping consumers safe. And it is humbling to work alongside such devoted and talented people. Having the opportunity to lead CPSC is the culmination of many aspects of my life. I joined the Commission in 2013 after being nominated by then-President Barack Obama. I was confirmed by voice vote by the Senate. In February of 2017, I assumed the duties of the acting chairwoman. Prior to joining the Commission and serving in Congress, I have spent my career in healthcare, first as a registered nurse and later as a New York State Assistant Attorney General representing a teaching hospital. I have spent my life in advocacy, and now it is truly an honor to lead the Consumer Product Safety Commission. For our agency, 2019 got off to a challenging start with the government shutdown. During the shutdown, CPSC operated with a skeleton crew of accepted employees. These dedicated individuals reviewed more than 10,000 incident reports, analyzing information from a variety of sources, including NICE, our National Electronic Injury Surveillance System, the CPSC hotline, and saferproducts.gov. Operating according to the procedures specified in our shutdown directive, staff sought to identify any incidents that rose to the level of an imminent hazard threat to human safety. Once the government reopened, all CPSC staff began working tirelessly to clear the backlog and return to normal operations. Specifically, they have opened and completed all investigations into incidents warranting an in-depth investigation, processed and reanalyzed the over 10,000 other incidents, reviewed and assessed all Section 15B reports and are processing potential cases, evaluated all saferproducts.gov reports received and published that were eligible, and announced multiple recalls that occurred during the shutdown. Beyond the valiant efforts of what the staff did in coping with the shutdown, I do want to talk this morning to the committee about our funding. Certainty is critical to our agency, and knowing that we are funded through the remainder of fiscal year 2019 is a relief. However, additional funding in the coming fiscal year is essential to help us move more efficiently and effectively to execute our mission. On March 28th, CPSC submitted its budget to request to Congress at the level of $127 million for FY 2020, a mark set by OMB and the President. I am grateful for the level the President funded us, as it is higher than in years past, but our agency faces challenges in executing our mandate with such a limited level budget. This morning, I am imploring each and every member of this subcommittee to advocate on behalf of the CPSC for a higher budget. To provide the CPSC more flexibility to accumulate larger balances needed for major investments, especially in information technology, I continue to advocate support to move a part of the CPSC budget to a no-year appropriation that would be available until expended. This no cost would give us the needed flexibility to use money across fiscal years for larger investments, to deal with unexpected shortfalls, and generally to make higher return uses of year-end balances. CPSC not only needs to maintain the capabilities it currently has, but as discussed this morning, also to expand our effectiveness and our efficiency. Each year we do not keep pace with inflation, more and more mission funding is redirected to offset cumulative inflation costs. In addition, programmatically, we need a more robust budget to ensure we are fully equipped to deal with the rapidly changing global marketplace, where the types of products and how consumers buy and interact with those products is constantly evolving. All of this requires consistent, adequate, and additional funding. CPSC's mission is a critical one. As a mother of 6 and a grandmother of 18, I know that nothing is more important than the safety of our children and our families. The role of the chairman is a critical one, and I do not take this responsibility lightly. I'm committed to keeping our positive working relationship with Congress so together we can work to keep the consumers safe. Thank you very much, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. I appreciate. There we go. And now, Commissioner Feldman, you are welcome to speak for 5 minutes.
Good morning. I want to begin by thanking Chairwoman Schakowsky, Ranking Member McMorris-Rodgers, the members of the Subcommittee on Consumer Protection and Commerce for providing me this opportunity to appear before you today. It has been a privilege to serve under the leadership of Acting Chairman Burkle as a CPSC Commissioner since my confirmation last October. I am relatively new to the agency, and I previously served as Senior Counsel to Chairman John Thune on the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation. As a Senate staffer, I work directly on CPSC oversight matters, and therefore I understand the important function that hearings like this serve. I also come to the agency with a deep understanding of the congressional intent behind the statutes governing the agency, its duties, and its limits under the law. The title of this hearing asks an important question. Is the Consumer Product Safety Commission fulfilling its mission? My view is that the Commission is doing many things well, that there are areas in which we are making progress, and others in which we could be doing more to protect American consumers from dangerous products. As a commissioner, my priority is to advance the agency's safety mission through inclusiveness and compromise. In the short time I've been at the agency, I am most proud of the opportunities that I've had to collaborate with my fellow commissioners on bipartisan solutions. These include bipartisan support to increase agency transparency in the form of an open meeting to approve the agency's budget request, the first such meeting in recent memory and a tradition I hope we will continue. Along with Commissioner Biacco, we have advanced a number of amendments with bipartisan support, including efforts to strengthen the agency's data science expertise, to prioritize enforcement of the Child Nicotine Poison Prevention Act, and to accelerate a mandatory standard to protect children from furniture tip-overs. More work needs to be done, but I'm encouraged by this forward progress. During my confirmation hearing in June of last year, I laid out a number of priorities I felt would achieve the Commission's goals of protecting American consumers from unreasonable risks of danger. These include modernizing the Commission's data collection and processing capabilities to identify emerging hazards and to support its enforcement, standards, and regulatory work. I testified that the Commission must rethink its market surveillance capabilities, including with respect to e-commerce and new and emerging distribution models. And as a general matter, that the CPSC must advance safety through engagement with safety groups and the regulated community alike. It must do so with transparency and clarity about its expectations, and these remain critical priorities necessary to advance CPSC's mission. Again, our work remains ongoing. To further the goal of modernizing the Commission, I am excited that the agency is leading the creation of an interagency working group along with the Federal Communications Commission, the Federal Trade Commission, FDA, DOT, and NIST to tackle issues pertaining to the Internet of Things and connected devices. More can be done to close the agency's skills gap with respect to new and emerging technologies and consumer products, and you mentioned this in your opening statement. While I am pleased that the agency voted to accept our proposal to hire a chief data officer, more work remains to be done to ensure that this position is funded and implemented appropriately. I also believe that the Commission should explore the creation of a chief technologist to expand staff expertise as many of our sister agencies have done. To further the goal of transparency, I maintain an open door and encourage all stakeholders to share their concerns with me. This invitation applies to consumer groups, trade associations, legislators, companies, individual consumers, and their families. I've also worked to stress the importance of the Commission's independent Inspector General and to highlight the numerous important recommendations that remain outstanding. I have urged staff and the Commission to work to implement these recommendations expeditiously and will continue to do so. In closing, I look forward to continuing our efforts to keep American consumers safe through a bipartisan, collaborative, and forward-looking agency. Thank you again, Madam Chairwoman, for holding this important hearing and for your work to protect consumers. I look forward to this important discussion and to responding to a member's questions. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I'd like to yield 5 minutes to Commissioner Kaye for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, Chairman Schakowsky, Ranking Member McMorris Rodgers, and the members of the subcommittee. Thank you for holding this critical oversight hearing. I am pleased to be here with my friends and colleagues, Acting Chairman Burkle and Commissioners Adler, Biacco, and Feldman. Today we are representing the work of approximately 550 dedicated career staff at the Consumer Product Safety Commission. I am truly honored to work with them and my fellow commissioners in furtherance of the CPSC's mission to save lives and protect the public from unreasonable risks of harm associated with consumer products. Every day, our actions affect the lives of all Americans, whether they realize it or not. We take very seriously our jurisdiction and its accompanying responsibility to keep consumers safe. When the CPSC is at our best, we are using our limited resources and full authorities to make products safer through strong consumer protection standards. When the CPSC is at our best, we are leading the charge to end persistent hazards such as furniture tipping over and killing young children, or toddlers strangling on dangerous window blind cords. When the CPSC is at our best, we are actively seeking recalls of dangerous products with comprehensive and consumer-friendly recalls, using our litigation authority when it is necessary. We are assessing and pursuing real civil penalties as appropriate to deter bad actors from selling recalled goods and failing to report to us as they are required to do so under the law. When the CPSC is at our best, we are funding innovative safety research, writing effective testing protocols, and driving much safer product designs to market. We are anticipating safety problems with emerging technological innovations such as the Internet of Things or electronic rideshare scooters. I believe that the CPSC and our outstanding staff can do many of these things. I have seen them do it. But even at our best, we still need help from Congress. While this is not an exhaustive list, we need revisions to our statutes to eliminate unnecessary hurdles to developing mandatory safety standards. We need enhanced authorities to get dangerous products recalled and off the market quickly. We need additional authorities to assess fines at our ports to discourage repeat offenders from trying to bring violative and defective products into our country. And we need the anti-consumer safety and anti-transparency requirements of Section 6B of the Consumer Product Safety Act to be eliminated so we can provide the public with vital product safety information in a timely manner. People die because of 6B. It is as simple as that. We also desperately need more resources. I know this is not an appropriations hearing, but our current budget of $127 million is just not enough. It is truly amazing to me how underfunded consumer product safety is. It's kind of sad, really. It's also totally unnecessary. With Congress's support for additional authorities, adequate funding, and continued robust oversight, we can stay true to our safety mission. Thank you again for the invitation to speak with you about the CPSC, and of course I look forward to answering all of your questions.
Thank you. And now we will begin questioning from the members of the committee, of the subcommittee, and I will begin. So I want to talk a bit about furniture tip-overs. And I hear you talking about a final, about not a mandatory standard being developed, but in the meantime, I think that I've been really disappointed in the speed of which we've seen these dangerous products being taken off the market. Every 14 days, a child dies from a tip-over. Commissioner Adler and Kay, at the CPSC March meeting, you pushed for a more streamlined process for getting stronger standards for the children's furniture, but you were outvoted at that meeting. And I wonder if each of you can explain what you were trying to do and how it would have helped save lives. And let's start with Commissioner Adler.
Thank you very much for that question. I think when Commissioner Kay and I proposed our amendment, we understood that it would apply just to children's clothing storage units, but on the philosophy that even if you can't protect everyone, that doesn't mean you shouldn't protect anyone. The big advantage of moving under this special streamlined provision of the Consumer Product Safety Act is speed. We could have a clothing storage unit rule for children probably within months, whereas I guarantee it's going to take us years under the more slow and cumbersome procedures of the Consumer Product Safety Act before we can enact a standard. And I just want to make one quick point. The standard for clothing storage units is probably, if we were to do it, word for word what we would do under these more cumbersome procedures. It will just be a little bit broader in scope than doing a children's clothing storage unit. So I regret that our colleagues did not agree with us on that point.
Commissioner Kay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think Commissioner Adler certainly summed up all the important points on why we proposed the amendment. I would also just add, and this goes to the topic of this hearing, is the agency doing enough? In my mind, this is one of those issues where we should be pursuing every authority we have. Whatever tool is available to us, we should be doing that with regard to this hazard. And so I think while we both looked at moving under 104, as Commissioner Adler mentioned, is not maybe a perfect solution, it certainly is a tool that's available to us. It would make a difference in the marketplace. It would accelerate rulemaking. It would send a signal, which I think is important. It would send a signal to industry that we are not leaving any tool unused, and that is the larger piece of the theme that you're looking at, and I think is so critical in your question.
Thank you. Let me also, one of the problems with voluntary standards is that they are really hard to enforce. And I hope and expect that if the CPSC is deferring to a voluntary standard for now, that it is monitoring compliance adherence to that standard. So, Acting Chairman Burkle, how is the CPSC ensuring that furniture is meeting the voluntary standard, and how soon do you think that we can have a more robust final mandatory standard to make sure that these kids are safe?
Thank you very much, Chairwoman Schakowsky. And let me just reiterate how significant this issue is and one of the top priorities of the agency, where we have invested a lot of funding into doing testing to inform the agency. With regards to the 104 process, the concern was that it was just addressing too narrow a slice of dressers and just too small of the number of dressers. There are millions and millions of dressers out there. This past February at ICFSO, I announced to the public that the agency would begin, and our compliance deputy director sent out a letter to industry advising them that we will now be enforcing the voluntary standard and to make sure their dressers are compliant with the voluntary standard that is currently in place. However, I also sent a letter to the ASTM committee advising them to go to 60 pounds and to broaden the scope of dressers to 27 inches and above, because that has been a topic, as you know, as we've discussed, a topic that has just been languishing in the ASTM committee. And hopefully that right now, as we speak, is being balloted.
Let me just say that I have a piece of legislation called the Sturdy Act that I hope all of you will look at. Just like the Consumer Product Safety Improvement Act, I think that this is an issue that could use some legislation. I'm hoping that the Commission will support it. I now yield to the ranking member for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. To Acting Chair Burkle, I just wanted to give you a chance here at the beginning of today's hearing if you wanted to respond to any of the recent attacks that we've seen recently on your record of public service, and especially safety-focused public service.
Thank you very much. As I mentioned in my opening statement, there is nothing more important to me than safety, and I have said from the outset, safety is not political, nor should it be political, in how we keep consumers safe and we enforce our statute. The recent story, and I will speak to that and take the opportunity, and then I want to very quickly segue into the good things the agency has done. But it's important to understand, one of the narratives was that I'm not in favor of recalls, but I think it's also important to note that we already had a recall with Britax in 2017, just after I became the acting chairman. There was also an allegation that I kept my fellow commissioners in the dark. I think it's really important to understand that the commissioners, all of us, were informed about this very issue in June of 2016 before I ever became chairman, in September of 2016 before I ever became chairman, and then subsequently in April of 2017. So there was never any attempt to keep my colleagues in the dark. Two of those reports, I wasn't even in the chairman's office. And additionally, commissioners have the opportunity to meet with senior staff on a regular basis and are informed about what's going on at the commission. And then I think most importantly, the issue of the why settle? Why should we settle with Britax instead of allowing that to go the course throughout the litigation? And I think it's very important when we make decisions as an agency and as commissioners, which we are the decision-making body, we take all of these factors into account. And when I thought about the Britax and the opportunity to settle that issue, rather than prolonged litigation, I compared it to a recent situation that we had at the CPSC, where, again, a firm did not want to do a recall. So we sued them to do the recall, which is precisely what happened in the Britax matter. That complaint was filed in the former case in 2012. In 2019, 7 years later, the district court opinion on reconsideration held that requirement and that trying to force the recall as unlawful, and they vacated it. So in a 7-year period, We used valuable resources of the agency, and the consumer never got the safety information, never had a remedy for the recall. And so in the case of Britax, it seemed to me, let us get that information to the consumer. Let's make sure that consumer understands how to get that stroller to work correctly. Let's settle this. It's what our staff advised us to do. And that is what happened. And so in the case of Britax, the complaint was filed in 2018, and in November of 2018, there was a settlement agreement. And now we will monitor that plan very closely, and we will also make sure they will send us reports about the recall, and we will monitor those very closely that they've complied with the settlement agreement. If I could take a minute, I think it's really important to talk about the good work of the agency. We heard it from my colleague, Commissioner Biacco, but we, in the last 2 years since I've been chairman, we have passed 6 mandatory standards. We've revised 8 mandatory standards. We have NPRs out for 2 durable nursery products. We have an ANPR for clothing storage unit tip over. 3 critically voluntary standards, 3 critically important voluntary standards have been enacted and are in effect. One is window coverings that went into effect 2018, critically important. Second is, I mentioned with the tip overs, they are balloting those 2 60 pounds and under 27 inches and above as we speak today. And portable generators. 2 voluntary standards are in place that will keep the consumer safe now. They are in the market. Those are 3 critically important voluntary standards the agency, through the hard work of our staff, has accomplished. Furniture tip overs we've talked about. I think one of the important issues to this committee is saferproducts.gov. It is a way for the consumer to access information, and we are in the process of we had a public hearing on it. We did an RFI. The staff will collect all of that information, come back to the commission, and help us to understand what can we accomplish quickly, what will take more funding. And again, that's one of the projects that I would really appreciate additional funding for, to make saferproducts.gov more robust. We have continued coordination with other government agencies, making sure that there are no gaps between our safety work. Recall effectiveness has become a priority of the agency. We had a workshop, an RFI follow-up, and as Commissioner Biacco pointed out, the new recall app has been launched, thanks in part to her hard work on that issue. And most importantly, we've stopped millions of unsafe products at the ports, and that is something I'd like to talk about when we get to recall effectiveness.
Okay,
so thank you.
Thank you. My time has expired. I do have further questions. I will submit them to the record.
And now let me yield to the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I mentioned in my opening that Congress passed the Child Nicotine Poisoning Prevention Act in 2016 that requires liquid nicotine containers to meet special packaging requirements of the Poison Prevention Packaging Act, including child-proofing and flow restrictions. The letters CPSC issued on implementation and enforcement of these requirements have been confusing, in my opinion. One letter failed to advise companies of the flow restrictor requirements. Another mentioned them but indicated that CPSC would be issuing future guidance, raising questions of whether companies must comply with the flow restriction requirements in the meantime. And I think that flow restriction is a serious concern and was included in the law for a reason. Now, I have here a product called the Milkman, which was purchased online, and this is with vaping, right? It's a bottle of liquid nicotine that has no flow restrictor at all, and if you open it up, if you want to, you can, but at your own risk. If you open it, you can see that it could be simply dumped out in an amount that could easily kill a child. And these kinds of containers are still readily available in stores and online. This one was purchased online. So when I asked you, Chairman or Chairwoman Buerkle, what is CPSC doing to ensure that it enforces the law? Because this is illegal, and including, surveillance of stores, websites, and that makes its expectations clear to companies so they're not allowed to sell this.
Thank you very much, Chairman Pallone. Thank you for the question. I would reiterate your concern with regards to liquid nicotine. In 2016, when the statute was passed and my colleague, Mr. Feldman at the time was in the Senate and was very active in his work on that issue. In 2016, the agency immediately issued letters putting companies on notice, putting firms on notice that we would now begin enforcing the child nicotine poison prevention.
But they're still for sale.
Subsequent to that, we have sent out additional letters on the exact issue you speak of, the flow restrictors.
Are those the ones that came from Commissioners Feldman and Biocco? I said after the letters I mentioned, they sent out letters, I guess in February, that indicated CPSC would be issuing guidance, and you issued a joint statement expressing concern about the confusion it may cause and reiterating CPSC's duty to immediately enforce the law. Is that subsequent? Is that what you're talking about now?
Yes, subsequent to the letters that were sent out advising of the Child Nicotine Poison Prevention Act, subsequent to that, the agency developed a testing methodology in addition to what was already in the statute, and they are now enforcing that. And again, that gets back to the limitations we have in terms of funding. This e-commerce situation that you're calling to our attention is critical, and additional funding for just e-commerce.
All right, well, I appreciate that, but you say that they're enforcing it now, but how? What are they doing to enforce it?
They have put together a plan. They'll physically go into a brick and mortar store where these products are sold. But in addition to, as with other issues, we also do online surveillance to see whether or not these products are safe or are available. And if they are available, then they will go.
All right, well, take a look at this one because this one is still for sale. All right, I appreciate it. Our staff will get back to you. But I mean, I just hope that we're going to see more enforcement action because clearly it's not enough at this point. Now, I just wanted to mention one thing about I don't suggest everyone let's put it away for now. So let's talk about counterfeit products for a minute. Last year, I sent letters to 5 major e-commerce retailers asking what they're doing to stop dangerous counterfeit products from being sold on their platforms. And these fake products may be made from shoddy materials or little or no quality control. I'm still concerned that sites like Amazon are not doing enough to police the sellers. Can I just ask either Commissioner Feldman, you previously spoken of a need for CPSC to be more engaged in this area. Can you want to tell me what CPSC is doing to protect consumers from these counterfeit products and what more should be done? I know we're running out of time, but if you would try to answer it for me, I'd appreciate it.
The issue of counterfeit products runs much broader than our jurisdiction that has to do specifically with safety. But where you have a counterfeit product where IP considerations are being ignored, there is a high degree of correlation that in fact, the necessary safety and certification testing that goes along with that's also being ignored. I see that this light is blinking red, but I do think that we have a lot more that we can be doing to engage online platforms and to expand our market monitoring capabilities to take a look at direct-to-consumer shipments. In many ways, the counterfeit issue is not exclusively, but it is predominantly an e-commerce issue. And I agree that some additional resources and efficiencies with respect to our existing resources can be better leveraged to make progress in this area. But I thank you for raising the question. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
And now I recognize Mr. Latta for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and to our commissioners, thanks very much for being with us today. Really appreciate it. And the Internet of Things is an issue I've been focused on in my time in Congress, and especially in the last Congress, I introduced the Smart IoT Act, which directed the Department of Commerce to create a compendium of essentially who is doing what at both the federal level and at industry. And I also formed the Internet of Things working group with my friend Representative Welsh from Vermont. And we should focus on minimizing agency overlap and duplicative burdens that hamper innovation. If I could start with, Chairman, with you, if I may. What interagency efforts have you been able to undertake at the CPSC on the issue of the Internet of Things?
Thank you very much for the question, Congressman Latta. We, first of all, have taken this issue very seriously and understand the implications it could have for safe products. We had a public hearing on IoT and had many stakeholders come in and testify as to what they saw our role as the agency, and it was a very robust discussion. Subsequent to that, as my colleague Commissioner Feldman alluded to, we have, and we are taking a lead. As a small agency, we are taking the lead in the Internet of Things. We have a person who's detailed to my office who is running the IoT initiatives. And again, what Commissioner Feldman said, that we will be having in April a intergovernmental discussion and meeting just to discuss the very issues that you've raised. Who is doing what? What do we consider our jurisdiction to be? And how will we address making sure these products are safe? And that, as was, again, Commissioner Feldman mentioned, our jurisdiction isn't the privacy, but when that hack or that breach or that malfunction of the software occurs, how it affects the safety of the product, that is our concern. And so we all need to be talking to each other as government agencies, making sure that we have all of the bases covered, making sure we're not crossing over and getting in each other's way, but also having a mechanism to discuss this once a hazard is identified.
Well, thank you. And if I could maybe continue on, Commissioner Feldman, because again, in your testimony, you talk about the working group that you put together with the FCC, FTC, FDA, DOT, and NIST. And I'm interested because, again, we want to make sure that, we are protecting the consumer out there, especially when we see what's happening in hacking and all, especially when you see with the working group you're putting together. What do you envision that you'll be doing with the commission, with the other agencies and departments?
Yes, sir. And thank you again for your work on the Smart IoT Act. That's a piece of legislation that I think advances goals similar to what's currently underway at CPSC. The purpose of the working group is interagency coordination, not regulation. I think it's important at this stage in the game with a nascent technology that agencies are aware of the respective efforts on connected devices across the federal government. CPSC is a safety regulator. We are not a security regulator. I see, or a privacy regulator, as the acting chairman mentioned, that's a set of responsibilities that falls to agencies like the Federal Trade Commission and the Secret Service. But that said, there are situations that are likely to arise where a security vulnerability and a safety risk share a common nexus. When those situations arise where there's a problem that is a crisis that emerges that implicates a number of agencies' jurisdictions, at this stage, I think having agency staff speaking to one another so that in those critical 24 hours of a crisis, CPSC staff isn't calling somebody at NIST or FTC or Secret Service to introduce themselves and have a question about jurisdiction when those critical minutes are taken away. So in that respect, I think taking these steps at this stage is a worthwhile effort.
Thank you. Chairman Burkle, in the CPSC 2020 budget request, you state that the CPSC will prioritize its resources on the products with the highest consumer product safety risk. Can you elaborate on how you will accomplish this, and will your decisions about risk also be guided by scientific, solid, and reliable data?
Thank you. Yes, thank you for that question. CPSC is a data-driven agency, and it is critical to us that we have access to robust data. It is also critical that we have the ability to analyze that data to make sure we have a good understanding of the issues and the incidents that are out there. It's only been compounded now with e-commerce and some developments. And so in our budget, those initiatives, which don't deal with our day-to-day initiatives and efforts, are more traditional models, will go by the wayside because we don't have the capabilities because of the lack of funding, because of our budget essentially hasn't kept current with inflation. Our contracts go up, wages go up, and then that takes away from our critical mission budget. So it's important, and why I think all of us would agree the agency needs additional funding.
Well, thank you very much. My time has expired.
Thank you very much.
And now I yield to Congresswoman Castor for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chairwoman Schakowsky, for holding this important hearing. It's been too long since this committee held a proper oversight hearing. For example, our colleagues on the other side of the aisle have not had the Consumer Product Safety Commission here since May of 2015. So I'm pleased that you and the Democratic majority are reclaiming our vital oversight duties. Over the past 2 years, a number of major hurricanes have made landfall in the United States. Harvey, Maria, Irma, Michael, devastated communities across the country, and I'm coming from Florida, I'm particularly sensitive to this. After hurricanes sweep through, many Americans are left without power for days or weeks, and in some cases months. After Hurricane Maria, Puerto Rico was without power for 11 months. In the aftermath, portable generators can supply emergency power to those in desperate need. However, portable generators can be deadly. They emit 450 times the amount of carbon monoxide as an idling car. On average, 73 people die each year from carbon monoxide exposure from generator exhaust. After Hurricane Irma, at least 12 Floridians lost their lives because of portable generators. And according to the CPSC's own data, generators killed 849 people or caused brain damage and sickness, and many more from 2005 to 2016. In 2016, the Commission recognized that something needed to be done, and the commissioners voted 4-1 to go forward with a notice of proposed rulemaking for a mandatory portable generator safety rule. That rule, which could prevent numerous deaths, has still not gone into effect. Acting Chair Burkle, in 2016, you were the lone commissioner who opposed moving forward with a mandatory portable generator safety rule. That means out of the 5 commissioners, you were the only one to oppose such rule, and you stated that you favored a voluntary standard over a mandatory standard. How many preventable deaths need to occur before the Commission, under your leadership, issues a mandatory safety standard? In other words, do you foresee any circumstance where you would support a mandatory rule?
Thank you very much, Congresswoman Castor, for that question. First, let me just tell you how important and seriously the CPSC takes the issue of carbon monoxide poisoning. It is one that we've spent a tremendous amount of resources on in trying to address the hazard. I would tell you that the ANPR for the mandatory standard began in 2006. The NPR was published in 2016. So 10 years elapsed before we ever did anything to get an NPR. Apparently there was difficulties in developing the technology. We waited for a study to come from the University of Alabama, which was a low emission technology. In the meantime, industry, and there's actually at the end of the day 2 voluntary standards with shutoff technology that really make the consumers safe, and they have addressed the hazard, so we hope.
But a lot of manufacturers even didn't want to adopt longer cords. I mean, that's not something that takes a lot of research and time, but they wouldn't go along with that. And why wouldn't you sign a letter to retailers that was circulated by the other commissioners urging retailers to stock generators with new safety features?
I think first and foremost because the generators weren't available and the letter was going to cause confusion. The generators that had the new technology that was compliant with the voluntary standards was not available until approximately a year and a half later. And so sending out a letter...
you were in the minority on that, though. Why did you provide that draft letter to industry representatives and note that you intended to discourage the other consumer product safety commissioners from sending that letter?
I disagree on the first premise that I provided the letter because no letter was ever provided to PGMA. And that's very important, and I never would have provided
Commissioner
it
Kay, you thought that it was important for the Commission to adopt a mandatory portable generator safety rule. Is that right? Could you tell us why?
That is correct, and if the chairman would indulge me for a moment in the answer. this goes back to what I said in my opening, when the
Okay,
CPSC is,
quickly, because she's out of time. Go
when the
ahead.
CPSC is at its best, it's driving research, and the staff led to the breakthrough that caused us to move forward with that mandatory standard. And even if the voluntary standard is perfect, there's a good part of the market that would never comply with the standard, and so we need a mandatory and standard to enforce it anyway.
Thank you.
Thank you. The gentlewoman yields back, and now let me recognize Mr. Bouchon for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. And Chair Burkle, good to see you. You were elected with me in 2010 and part of the nurse caucus, so it's good to see you. I want to ask you, there's been some conversation this morning about additional funding for the agency. And in the previous budget increases, the agency spent a significant amount of money on a new logo, for example. So I guess that spurs a question. How would you approach the calls for additional funding for the agency in an environment of limited resources? And I guess I'm asking, what are the critical funding priorities that would be addressed with everyone's request for more funding, which, by the way, I'm not against, based on what you've said?
Thank you very much for the question, because since I have been at the agency and I found myself in a peculiar position as a conservative in the House of Representatives, always talking about spending, once I got to the agency and realized what the agency needed to function properly and function well, I began to ask for increased funding since I've been at the agency. We need, the agency is a data-driven agency. We need to improve our sources of data, and we need to improve our capability of looking at data and analyzing that data. And so those kinds of system improvements require a substantial amount of money. In addition, we heard from my colleague, Commissioner Biacco, about in terms of the system itself. We've heard from the agency, from our IT person, our system is old. It's got some issues with it, and rather than just cobbling together and making it worse, we need to really look at our systems, make sure across sectors of the agency, various areas can communicate. There's a lot of modernization that needs to occur at the agency, in addition to just improving our ability to collect data and then analyze that data.
So I'm assuming, I haven't read your budget request, but I'm assuming that is outlined, that type of information is outlined to Congress?
It is. It's in an appendix.
Because I've always found it helpful, when agencies come and request more money, that it's helpful to Congress to outline specific priorities. Because as I kind of half-jokingly said, the new logo thing, I've found since my time in Congress, and I'm in my 5th term, that although I don't necessarily agree with Congress line by line telling you how to spend your money, it is helpful when we're making decisions on increasing funding to have those priorities in front of us, so I'd encourage that.
And if I could just add one more thing, and that is what we're dealing with at the agency is that the traditional brick and mortar scenario that we're all used to, that so much of our work is geared towards, now we see a shift with e-commerce, IoT. We've talked about these issues this morning. And to be able to look at the modernization, to look at the way the consumers are accessing and buying goods is critically important as well.
Okay. Commissioner Feldman, I understand that some recall completion rates are very low, while others are 100%. Can you explain why relying solely on the recall completion rate of products could be misleading?
Thank you for the question. I previously served on the Senate Commerce Committee, where that particular subcommittee had jurisdiction not only over CPSC that deals with consumer products, but also over the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration that deals with automotive recalls. In the automotive recall scenario, you are talking about, in most households, the largest family asset short of real property. And even in that context, where automotive safety defects are extremely likely to result in death and injury, those recall completion rates are low. In the consumer product context, you're dealing with consumer products that are at a lower price point, that tend to be disposable. And there are issues that we find in terms of getting the recall numbers to a level that that are acceptable. In terms of the agency's ability to effect direct notice, I think that that's a perennial challenge that we're facing. But I think you're asking the right questions.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Vesey, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wanted to ask Ms. Burkle a question. And I know that because of your work there, that you understand how important this commission is, particularly for consumers to have confidence in the products that they use on a daily basis. You know, there is a recall now out on a child seat because of some turnovers and some deaths that have occurred with this particular child seat. Even toasters, like everyday appliances like toasters that we use, sometimes can occur in death. Sometimes it doesn't have anything to do with the product itself, but just the consumer use. But sometimes it can be because of a faulty product, and we've seen recalls on those. And I think that Representative Castor, talking about the generators and some of the concern with carbon monoxide poisoning and deaths, is something that is really real. And I think that you would agree that those are real consumer safety issues, correct?
I would certainly agree with that.
So could you clarify what you meant earlier? Because I wanted to give you a chance when you said that you didn't believe in recalls, because obviously if they're faulty generators or toasters or child seats, if those products were faulty, I'm assuming you would want them recalled. So what did you mean earlier when you said you didn't believe in recalls?
What I was explaining to the ranking member, McMorris Rogers, there was a narrative out there that I am not in favor of recalls. And in fact, that is not true, and that was my opportunity to explain. Of course I'm in favor of recalls. If there is, and 99.9% of our recalls are voluntary. Firms come to us, they report, and they work closely with our staff to not only make sure that the recall is effective and it is done properly, but to share in the message and the media, accessing the media. And then beyond that, our staff works very closely with the firm to make sure they're doing what they said they would do in terms of the recall. So yes, recalls are very important to me. It's a critical part of our mission.
Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I wanted to ask also a question to Mr. Adler, particularly as it relates to consumers over the age of 65. As you know, we have about 10,000 baby boomers a day turning 65 years old, and I'm really concerned specifically about product safety as it relates to older Americans, baby boomers that are aging very rapidly, particularly the baby boom generation, because their intent is to be more active than the generation before them as it relates to living independently, being able to go and continue to travel and do all sorts of things, and we obviously want to keep them safe. And I was just wanting to know if you could talk about some of the work that the Commission is doing to address some of the issues regarding senior citizens, because I think it's going to continue to be a big issue as this large group of our population grows.
Thank you so much. And as I said, I'm a proud member of senior citizen population, so it is an issue of great concern to me. And I didn't make one point that I really did want to stress here. Right now, seniors constitute about 13% of the population. We constitute 65% of consumer product-related deaths. The majority of those are from falls on things like stairs and flooring, which can be improved. There's a substantial number that occur with respect to fires. Seniors die at a much higher rate when it comes to fire hazards. Just think of somebody walking around in robe and pajamas and getting their arms too near to an open flame, or sometimes leaving an open flame on when they go to sleep. So in addition to being a healthier group, we need to be a safer group. And things that I think the Commission can do, and I put these into three categories. The first is sometimes there are products that are just exclusively for seniors. Those are products like adult bed rails and products like emergency medical alerts. And those are things that we can focus on the same way we focus on products especially made for children. In addition, there are a lot of products that harm all consumers, but they disproportionately affect seniors. My own view is that where we find something that is truly disproportionately harming and killing seniors, we ought to have a streamlined procedure for writing safety standards that address senior hazards in the same way we have specific 104 procedures for addressing risks that apply to children. In addition, even if we're not going to regulate a product, I do think we need to encourage manufacturers to note that their products are harming seniors in disproportionate ways, and at least to encourage them to take safety steps. And I'll give you one quick example. Climbing a ladder. I don't think anybody over the age of 75 should climb ladders that are higher than their waists, but if they're going to do that, I would hope manufacturers would put railings on the ladders so they would be safer. Right. So there are many things that I think the Commission ought to be doing.
Thank you.
I thank the gentleman for his question, because I was going to ask for extra time to let you finish your thought that you had started in your opening statement. And now I yield to Mr. Griffin for 5. Oh.
He's waved on, so stay on your side.
Where is he, Mr. Guthrie? No, who?
Here, we're here. Matsui.
I see, because you're waving on. Okay, and so now I yield to Ms. Matsui for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In 2013, California amended TB 117, the state's Technical Bulletin on Fire Safety Standards for Furniture Flammability, to significantly reduce the presence of potentially dangerous flame retardant chemicals in furniture. As you are aware, commonly used flame retardants in furniture have been found to be associated with adverse health effects, including fertility complications, certain types of cancer, heart defects, and hormone disruption. Commissioner Adler, is CPSC currently examining a national flammability standard that would reduce the need for potentially hazardous flame retardants?
Thank you for that question, and I'd like to answer it in 2 ways. First of all, the Commission has directly addressed the issue of chemical hazards because one of the things that we are investigating is the possibility of addressing organohalogens, which are the flame retardants that are found in many, many children's products. And that's something that we're working vigorously on, in particular to address them as a class of hazard, not one by one.
Right.
With respect to the California standard, which is TB 117, this is a fascinating exercise to me because the chairman supports adoption of TB 117, the industry supports it, a lot of public health groups do, but there's one group that doesn't, and that's CPSC staff. And they've raised a number of very, very strong technical objections to the adoption of TB 117. But I'd like to go back to a point that I had raised earlier. We can't just adopt a California safety standard as in a very simple process the way we can use under our 104 rulemaking. We would have to go through these elaborate procedures that are very cumbersome in order to adopt something like TB 117. So I know the Commission is working, the Commission staff are working.
Well, I do hope that we do proceed as quickly as possible on this.
And
I know there might be some disputes, but let's try to move forward with this. I think this is such an important issue. We really do. I mean, this has been out there for quite a while, and we really need to deal with this. We should study this further and adopt uniform standards that will reduce the need for dangerous chemicals in furniture. And it's time we acted upon this. In 2015, this is another issue, the Office of Management Budget issued a memoranda requiring all publicly accessible federal websites to provide service only through HTTPS connection by the end of 2016. HTTPS protocol ensures that a consumer's connection is encrypted from their devices all the way to the federal government systems. Regular HTTP connections sent in plain text can be intercepted and exploited by anybody or anything between a user and the website, including someone using public Wi-Fi. The website created by the federal government to monitor HTTPS deployment stated that 78% of federal government domains are compliant, with CPSC at 88%. Ms. Burkle, our entire panel, are you aware of this work? If any, what remains to be done?
Thank you for your question, Congresswoman. I would appreciate the opportunity to get back to you and get the current status at the agency, and then we will report back to you as to what is happening and where we are with compliance.
Okay, I'm anxious to receive that. The Internet of Things has the potential to transform the services around us. For instance, connected devices can remotely monitor a diabetic's glucose levels or a patient in the ICU's vital signs, which in turn can help provide data to better treat patients and address issues potentially before they become symptomatic. And many consumers already have connected devices to their homes and on the go, from tracking personal fitness information to intelligent speakers and connected transportation services. But I'm concerned if we do not do more, we risk becoming overly reliant on technologies developed by foreign actors or standards that provide an unfair advantage to technologies developed in foreign markets. That's why I'm working on legislation to ensure we support a multi-stakeholder approach to this issue that promotes U.S. leadership in this process. The entire panel, as CPSC continues to grapple with IoT devices, do you see over-reliance on foreign technologies as a potential issue facing consumer product safety?
I'll answer that. Yes, I think you're raising a valid concern. You mentioned that you're working to develop legislation in this area. I'd want to commend your leadership in that respect and welcome an opportunity to review a draft of your legislation if and when that's available. I think IoT makes all sorts of connectivity possible, and there have been some exciting developments in this area, as you cited in your question. CPSC has a role to play with respect to connected devices that present an unreasonable risk of injury to consumers. I am aware that CPSC that our staff is in communication with standard-setting organizations like Underwriters Laboratory and other to develop our own standards with respect to connectivity and safety of IoT devices. I'm eager to watch how this standards activity progresses, but I see my time's expired.
Yeah, it has, and thank you. My time has expired too. I yield back.
Next, I yield to Mr. McNerney for 5 minutes of questions.
Well, I thank the chairman and the chairwoman, and I thank the commission for your testimony. I was here for it. Chairman Burkle, Chairwoman Burkle, I'm the co-chair of the Congressional Artificial Intelligence Caucus. And one of the things I'm trying to understand is how federal agencies are using artificial intelligence to improve their operations and how they can serve the American public. Do you have any examples of how the Commission is using AI today?
Thank you for your question. Let me begin by saying mostly what initiatives are happening now are machine learning and training machines to the technology to recognize incidents and recognize patterns of hazards and incidents. We do not use any AI currently, but again, that would be something that if Congress increased our appropriations, that would be something that would give us the flexibility to look at AI and make sure that we understand, first of all, to increase the amount of data coming to the agency, and then most importantly, to have the capability to analyze it.
That's kind of a recurring theme, that you need more resources.
Indeed.
Is the agency considering how it might use artificial intelligence in the future?
Yes, we are, and I'm welcome any of my colleagues to comment on that, but we certainly are looking at ways to make our jobs easier and help us to identify the issues that are before us.
One of the ways that I believe that would help the agency immensely is in hazard identification prior to the injury or hazard occurring. If you just watch on a Sunday afternoon on NFL, there are opportunities, and you see them say, the announcers put up the AI and say, there's a 50 chance of this happening or a 60 chance of this linebacker taking the ball this way. We should be doing that with the same type of technology, the same type of software to identify what hazards are coming down the pike and what the percentage of it is. I think that's the first place we would start.
Any other commissioners?
And to that end, I thought it was a good idea, and I mentioned this in my opening statement, that the commission explore the hiring or identification of a chief technologist at the agency. I know that the Federal Trade Commission, the Department of Transportation, FCC, our sister agencies have all done this with good results. Having somebody on staff to expand our technological expertise and identify how exactly the agency can leverage technologies like AI to help better identify emerging hazards, et cetera, would be useful. I was disappointed that that our amendment to include that in this year's budget request was ultimately not accepted. But I think there's opportunities, and I'd love to continue a dialogue with you to explore how we may make that come to a head.
Very good. Yeah, there's a significant difference between the administration's budget request and what actually gets appropriated. Commissioner Kay, you've previously spoken about the need for civil penalties to deter bad conduct. Would you elaborate on that?
Yes, obviously, Congressman, it's one of the important tools that Congress gave the agency to try to deter companies from not engaging in certain misconduct. And so during the time that I was chair, I recognized that the agency was not pursuing civil penalties consistent with the direction that Congress had given in the Consumer Product Safety Improvement Act, which called for higher civil penalties when warranted. We were basically taking the same fact patterns and applying the same pre-CPSIA levels to our evaluation. So my direction to staff was to heed the word of Congress and to vastly increase, as required, what we were seeking. And thanks to the leadership of our then General Counsel and her staff, we were very successful in doing that.
So do you have any data?
We do have data, and I'm sure the agency can provide it in the numbers and the cases that were pursued and what those penalties look like.
Okay. I have about a 3-minute question, so I'm going to just yield back at this point.
Mr. Guthrie, you were recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate that very much. And sorry, there's another hearing going on, so I've been back and forth. So I didn't get quite full discussion, but I was going to ask a question to Chair Burkle. And it kind of relates, I think, to what was going on. I didn't get the whole context of that, but it's civil penalties. I know during your time on the commission, you voted against civil penalties, and you've also overseen the largest civil penalty ever imposed by the commission. So could you just explain your philosophy and respect to civil penalties and when imposing, why you voted against some and why you were there when the largest one was moved forward? Just give your philosophy on civil penalties.
Thank you. My problem, and one of the reasons I don't always vote for a civil penalty, is process-wise. I find, if I could just opine 1 minute on the fact that when you are in the chairman's office versus when you are a commissioner in the minority, I think you have a little more leeway. But once you're in a leadership role, you have a different role to play, and that is to keep the agency running, to send a message to those who may have not reported timely, or to deter others from doing likewise. So to your point, we did enact the largest civil penalties, but my concern is that we are transparent and that the factors that we use in order to reach the amount of a civil penalty are consistent and transparent. And that, to me, is the most important thing about civil penalties. How did we get to that number? Sometimes I will disagree with my colleagues on the amount of the civil penalty. I will say that we also, not only for failure to report timely, but we also will enact a civil penalty for sale of recalled goods, which we have also done.
Okay, thanks. And I know I had a manufacturer of table saws, and well, it was in my district. After redistricting, they moved forward. And I know you issued a statement on April 27, 2017 of the publication of a proposed standard for table saws, and you found the proposal deficient. You said it in 2 counts. And the big concern of the manufacturing company wasn't the safety of the table at all. Matter of fact, quite the opposite. Was a mandated technology they felt that was patented, and they felt like it was going to be a mandated monopoly in that technology. That was their concern with that. Could you just talk about, I know you found that proposal to be deficient, and talk about that?
Thank you. Yes, that is my concern as well. There is no question about making table saws safer, and that certainly is, that would be a goal of the commission for sure, and the agency. But right now, I have concerns about whether or not any rule that we would promulgate would create a monopoly for one person. And I don't think that's the role of government. I will say, though, that the agency has been aggressive. We did a 2016 study, but more importantly, a 2017 study to try to link the injuries to the type of saw so we can be more informed in our decision making. the staff is preparing a package, a briefing package to all the commissioners to let us know what they discovered in not only the surveys, but then the survey went out for comment. That comment period is closed, and that will all be coming to the commission to understand the status right now of table sauce.
Okay. Commissioner Feldman, I saw you shaking your head, so if you want to add into.
With respect to table saws, I agree with the competition issues that were raised. I think I addressed the question from a more basic level. There have been some updates to the existing voluntary standard with respect to new guards and safety add-ons. That sort of, under the statute, dictates our posture with respect to how, if at all, we're able to proceed with a mandatory standard. I want to be careful in what I say because I would like an opportunity to confer with agency staff about the effectiveness of the existing standard and whether it adequately eliminates or reduces the risk. And now that standard's been out there for some time, whether or not there's substantial compliance from industry. Those are the two factors that we need to get to in order to move to a mandatory standard.
Okay,
But
thanks.
thank
And
you.
I'm getting short on time for my next question. So welcome back to Capitol Hill. It's always great to see you.
Thank you
Enjoyed
very
serving
much.
with you. So thank you very much, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and now I call on Mr. Rush for 5 minutes to ask your questions.
I want to thank you, Madam Chair, lady, and I certainly appreciate you and the ranking member having this hearing this morning, and appreciate your long-standing leadership on all issues related to consumer protection. In 2008, I served as the chairman of this subcommittee. At that time, it was known as the Subcommittee on Commerce, Trade, and Consumer Protection, and I was proud to author the Consumer Product Safety Improvement Act, CPSIA, back in 2008. So I'm familiar with the issues that the CPSC faces. And while I'm very pleased that we're here today discussing how far the CPSC has come, I know you and I will agree that there's much work that remains to be done by this agency. And I want to ask the acting chairman Burkle, the CPSC's notice of proposed rulemaking to amend Section 6B and remove some of the self-imposed burdens began in 2014, a long time ago. But we made little progress since then. And maybe you can tell me, Chairman Burkle, what's the status of the proposed rulemaking? And maybe you can also tell me, tell the committee, what accounts for the delay, and what can we expect the commission, when can we expect the commission to move this process forward?
Thank you very much, Congressman, and thank you for all of your work on CPSIA and the improvements, all of the work you've done to keep consumers safe. With regards to 6B and the proposed rule, if I have your permission, I am interested, my colleague here, Elliot Kay, are you just kidding me? Oh. He indicated to me that I can blame him for the delay. When 6B, I think that's very gracious of you. The NPR came out, there was just a tremendous amount of concern about the issues and what 6B protects and doesn't protect. And so the entire NPR was tabled, and at this time, quite honestly, there is no work being done on that issue.
So are you to say then that we are still at a point where you all are not moving forward at all? You can't tell me when you're going to break this log jam up?
All I can say is there is no work being done on 6B. It's an NPR. I think at this point, if we were to bring the NPR back up, it would have to be a new package because it is so old.
Well, Commissioner Kay, you stated that people die because of Section 6B. Those are your statements. Am I quoting you correctly?
That is correct. And
What rationale is there for maintaining Section 6B there?
if I may distinguish, Congressman Rush, between the statutory provision of 6B, which exists because of Congress, and the regulatory burden we added upon ourselves. When I became chair in 2014, I had to make a calculated decision with the limited resources we had. I had inherited the proposed rule from my predecessor, and at that point I made the judgment, because we had had so many persistent hazards that were pending, window blind cords, portable generators, ROVs, that it was better, the time was better spent on addressing those hazards that continue to kill people, as opposed to something that I felt Congress ultimately could take care of very easily, which is repeal of the statutory provision. And that's really what I'm urging. I think that if we were to pass the NPR, it would fiddle around the edges of 6B, but it's not going to change the fundamental issue that I mentioned in my opening statement. Only Congress repealing 6B would do that.
Well, I want to thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
I now yield to Mr. Cardenas for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you for having this important hearing. As a grandparent of 2 children, trust me, this commission that was started in 1972 hopefully will protect my grandchildren much better than it protected me. I was a toddler before 1972. I won't say what years, but let's just say that the purpose of it is, I think, what makes this country so respected around the world, is that we care about human life, we care about what can be done better, we care about making sure that there are sometimes winners and losers in the jobs that we do, but at the same time, the big winner is, especially when it comes to public safety, is every person, whether the child is newborn or whether it's somebody who decides that they want to still work in the sawmill at the age of 80 or 90 because that's what they love to do. They should be able to do it safely. I want to go to in 2018, CPSC published a consumer alert stating that it was aware of an infant death associated with inclined sleep products and alerting consumers to be aware of the hazards. Unfortunately, CPSC at that time didn't specify which products had resulted in infants' deaths. So I'm not sure how helpful this alert was for parents and grandparents who were trying to avoid dangerous products. Coincidentally, timed with this hearing, CPSC released another alert this past Friday to warn consumers about the Fisher-Price Rock and Play, noting that CPSC is aware of 10 deaths in the Rock and Play since 2015. I'm curious as to what changed between the consumer alert in 2018 and just last Friday. Section 6B of the Consumer Product Safety Act requires CPSC to notify the manufacturer before public disclosure of certain information and that the information disclosed is accurate and reasonably related to the effectuating the purposes of the Consumer Product Safety Act. The main purpose of that act is, quote, to protect the public against unreasonable risks of injury associated with consumer products, end quote. So to you, Chairman Burkle, when did you notify Fisher-Price of the alert issued this past Friday?
We have been working with Fisher-Price over the last several, I will say, at least the last year and even more so, and I have provided to the chairwoman a timeline with regards to what the agency has been doing and how seriously we are taking this issue because it is of grave concern. What occurred between the generic notice and this last notice was 1 death. And so we went specifically out with that more specific information.
So communicating with the corporation involved, it's part of your rules, I get that, but how comfortable are you with how long it took between the initial warning and then the specific warning?
Well, that's a very important question. It isn't as if nothing happened. And our staff does all of the engagement, and our staff is engaged with any firm that we are trying to get someone to do a recall with. But they, and we have several other initiatives that, again, I hesitate to publicly state here, but Chairwoman Schakowsky has an entire timeline of all of the activities that we are doing, because this is a serious issue for the agency.
That's fine. With my limited time, I just want to make sure that the public is aware that even with these incredibly responsible corporations, in my opinion, unfortunately, what happens is sometimes the corporation themselves look at certain things as a cost of doing business. And let me tell you, when it comes to the cost of doing business versus the life of a child, no comparison, in my opinion. Absolutely none. So when it comes to working with a corporation to try to get it right, and I understand the responsibility that you have to have, you certainly don't want to find yourselves in a litigation situation where a corporation will have one over on you, and besides the situation, hopefully it gets corrected. And then on top of that, they walk away with a few $1 million because they were unduly damaged because we were way too aggressive and we didn't mind our P's and Q's. So, but the thing is, I would hope that you're fortified with enough staff and team members to do the job as efficiently and quickly as possible. My last question is, how comfortable are you with the funding level for your organization to be able to do its job efficiently and effectively?
As I've mentioned several times here this morning, I think that we do need to have increased funding in order to even just to keep pace with inflation, but beyond that, to be able to look at emerging hazards, increase our data capabilities, increase our technology.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll be more blunt. Sounds like you're way underfunded. Thank you.
That is correct.
In my opinion.
Thank you.
I yield now for 5 minutes to Congresswoman Dingell.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's great to see you all. I'm sorry we're running between two hearings because both of you are really, really important. News reports indicate that several companies determined they needed to issue recalls during the government shutdown. And with most of the CPSC shutdown and most staff furloughed, no one knew how to proceed or help guide companies through the process. Some companies held off. Some companies posted recall notices on their websites. And then you later announced some of these recalls yourself on your own website, but not others. So I guess I'll start with Acting Chairman Buerkle. How is it that no one knew how to handle a recall during the shutdown? And how did CPSC inform companies how they were to address recalls during the shutdown?
Thank you very much for your question. So I think if I can speculate why they didn't know how to handle a recall is because 99.99% of our recalls are voluntary recalls, and a reporting agency works so very closely with staff. And staff determines and works with them to determine what the terms of the corrective action plan will be, what the press release will say. And so I think for a recalling firm, there was confusion as to how do we do this without CPSC. What was made clear during the shutdown was that the duty to report if a product could present a substantial product hazard, that duty did not go away, and I'm very pleased to say that industry reported during the shutdown to the same level they do when we're not shut down. But as soon as the government was back opened, our agency worked very closely with any of those firms that had a recall during the shutdown to make sure that we issued another press release, we put out the notice, and we followed our ordinary course.
So I've heard from we've all heard that there were companies that they didn't know how to alert you if there was a dangerous product, and consumers didn't know what to do. Were they able to report an incident on saferproducts.gov so other consumers could see it?
The good news is that the saferproducts.gov website was under contract. It was not affected by the shutdown, and consumers could report there. And again, that was one of the data sources that was reviewed by our accepted staff during the shutdown to make sure none of those reports in saferproducts.gov rose to the level of an imminent hazard to health and safety.
And according to your shutdown procedures, only 20 of your 550 employees were expected to work during the shutdown. How were you conducting import surveillance at U.S. ports with only a handful of staff?
The risk assessment methodology, the RAM as we call it, continued to run, but we were limited, quite frankly. And
So there were holes.
As I mentioned in my opening statement, the shutdown was a difficult way for our agency to begin 2019, and I'm very proud of what staff has done to catch up, but the ports were a problem and a challenging one.
I'm going to switch subjects. One of my colleagues called me because he didn't know that you were here. French Hill, who actually a Republican. Occasionally, we do work in a very bipartisan way, and had a child from his district killed by an elevator, tragic accident, and asked me to raise what is the consumer products, what is the commission doing about ensuring these home installed elevators are safe and children aren't dying. Whichever one of you, but probably.
Mrs. Dingle, thank you for the question. You're raising a serious issue. Just recently, we had an opportunity to meet with families and are aware of fatalities that have occurred with respect to the elevators. I would hesitate to comment more about what's going on with respect to agency and potential enforcement in this area. I'd like an opportunity to confer with staff and get back to you with a more fulsome answer.
But you are addressing it and know it's a serious problem.
I am aware of the issue, and I'm aware and understand very, very, very fully that it's a serious issue.
So I think all of us here care, and I would ask that French Hill from Arkansas also be included because it was his constituent, someone he knew that died. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentlewoman yields back, and now I yield to Mr. Carter.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank all of you for being here. This is an extremely important subject, and we appreciate all of your efforts in this area. I have the honor and privilege of representing the coast of Georgia, and we have two major seaports, the Port of Savannah and the Port of Brunswick. So this is of importance to us, and I wanted to start with you, Ms. Burkle, and ask you if you could just help me to understand how CPSC works with. It's my understanding you work with CBP to intercept potentially harmful shipments that are coming through our ports. I'm a little bit uneducated in this area, if you could just help me.
Thank you very much for your question, Congressman Carter. The CPSC is very engaged, and we have a very robust relationship with CBP. We are co-located at about 26 ports, major ports throughout the country. And we also work with them at CTAC, along with some other government agencies as well. Any government agency that has an interest in products coming into the country. And so in that process, we have what I referred to earlier was a risk assessment methodology. That is information, that is a system we have set up on algorithms to look at products coming into the country to see if they rise to a certain level, if it's a new importer, if they have a previous history, and that's how we identify products coming into the port. So our compliance officers who are at the various ports, we do not have the authority to seize the product, but CBP does, but then we will conduct any inspection. We do a lot of on-site testing. We do a lot of XRF technologies and identifying whether or not there's violative products coming in. And many of those products then will go to our lab in Rockville, Maryland for further testing.
One of the ports that we have in our district is Port of Savannah, which is the second largest container port on the eastern seaboard. So this is extremely important to us. And as I understand, you've had some success, I believe, in 2017 in the port of Charleston, that there were some a shipment of toy scooters that were found to have high levels of lead contamination. So that would be an example of something you're talking about?
That would be a very good example of it, and there are multiple other examples. And I am hopeful that all of the efforts at the ports where products are coming in may be one of the reasons why our recall numbers could be. I'm just speculating here, but I think we should really understand when we stop products from coming into the country that are dangerous, they never get into the consumer's hands. Therefore, a recall isn't necessary. And that, to me, prevention is the most important part of that.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to add to that because this deals with the Port of Savannah. I worked with a small business in Georgia who had a product that they identified as being counterfeit and was coming in only at the Port of Savannah. So they gave me a description and a sheet of paper that showed the product, what color it comes in and what it doesn't, and how it's packaged. And anything else was not the product, should not be coming in. So I was able to take that down to our to the people who work at the port. They were able to talk with their co-workers at CBP. And when they opened a box and saw this particular product was pink and not red, it's a non-compliant product, and they were able to stop it. So not all of the things that we're doing are high tech, but they do work. But I thought that would be a good example, particularly in your jurisdiction.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. This past weekend, I had the opportunity to travel with the Port Caucus here in Congress to Antwerp, Belgium, and they were showing us some of the products. In fact, they had one was somewhat comical. It was Adidas that had been spelled Abibus. So I hope that y'all catch something like that. But nevertheless, I've got just about a minute left. The 6B program, I guess that's a program that's very important, particularly for manufacturers too, so that they aren't necessarily, so that they have the opportunity to make sure that they are guilty, or at least they're innocent until proven guilty. So can you just very briefly, Ms. Burkle, explain the 6B program?
Sure. Congress and CPSA and then CPSIA address the issue of making sure that the information that we put out is fair and accurate, and that is the 6B protection. I know that there's a lot of discussion about 6B and the value of 6B because also in CPSIA, Congress also developed and implemented a saferproducts.gov website, and I think that affords the consumer the ability to go in and to search and to be able to access information about safety data. So I hope that there's a good balance there, but if Congress wants to change that authority, that is their decision.
Okay. Well, thank you very much again. Thank all of you for your work in this area. It's extremely important in the 1st District of Georgia as well. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and now Congresswoman Blunt Rochester will have 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all of you for your testimony and your attendance today. I want to focus first on internet-connected consumer products and cybersecurity. We've heard talk about the Internet of Things, the fact that your phone can actually control your alarm system, your lights in your house, your heating, and we also know that these devices can be hacked or disabled due to faulty software, potentially causing physical safety hazards. So one example that was particularly troubling to me was in Wired magazine. There's an article about scooters that can be controlled or hacked, accelerating or braking them by people external to the person. So researchers found that not just the scooters, which we've seen fleets of those in different cities, but even hoverboards can have this kind of problem. Someone being able to control your device from a remote location is deeply alarming for many reasons, not the least of which is your life can be in jeopardy. So it raises questions about security and safety of these devices within the Internet of Things. Including our kitchen appliances and locks and wearables. Commissioners Kay and Feldman, you've both spoken about some of these challenges before. How can CPSC address these alarming safety challenges?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for raising the Wired article. I'm familiar with it, and I've referred it to agency staff for further review. If it's okay with you, I'd like to follow up offline and give you an update. Using that as the example, the vulnerability and the particular exploit, as I understand it in that case, had to do with a Bluetooth vulnerability. I have concerns, and the agency has pointed out in its budget request to Congress that we have an expertise gap with respect to understanding new and emerging technologies, including things like Bluetooth. That's why I, along with Commissioner Biacco, advanced an amendment to hire a chief technologist. I know that sister agencies like the Federal Communications Commission and the Federal Trade Commission have brought individuals on in that role. They tend to be academic PhDs that split their time between academia and advising the Commission about things like Bluetooth exploits. I think we need to understand the technicalities behind those particular vulnerabilities before we can address them in a meaningful way. I'd also say that we're not, in and of ourselves, a security regulator in the sense that the Federal Trade Commission or the Secret Service is. That's why I think it's important that the agency's taken the step that it's taken to convene an interagency working group so that our staff can communicate with their counterparts across the independent and cabinet agencies so that at the very least we're all talking to each other and operating off a common set of facts.
All right. Commissioner Kaye?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I'm not even sure we can really call this an emerging technology anymore because it has emerged. And that's a major concern that I have. In 2017, the CPSC staff did an excellent report on emerging technologies, and I think they surfaced at that point, and we're happy to get you a copy. I think they surfaced the issues enough at that point to know that there are concerns that consumers should have about these products, and that when there is that vulnerability, there could be safety implications. Because I'm not a patient individual, especially when it comes to safety, after waiting a period of time, hoping that something else would emerge and not seeing it, my personal office staff and I drafted a paper of best practices that we have circulated and that we're happy to get you as well, that we feel like are a bare minimum really that should be adopted across the board to provide some comfort to consumers that these products are not going to operate in an unsafe fashion.
Thank you. You know, I actually am skipping all the questions I have in the middle because you brought up the chief technologist and also a chief data officer. I'm big on the future of work. It's really important to me, even to the point of starting a bipartisan caucus here, and you've heard other members talk about it as well. Commissioner Feldman, you mentioned something about opportunities that we can explore, I guess, in the interim. And I know I've heard the testimony so far about the needs that you really do have from a personnel basis. Are there things that we can do right now?
I believe that there are, and that's why I thought our amendment to add that position to our agency was timely. Looking across CPSC is a small agency. It is a resource-constrained agency. Simply throwing more money at the agency isn't always the right answer. I think that there are efficiencies to be had. When you look at our current staffing levels, we have around 30 vacancies right now. It is possible to pull within those existing vacancies, I believe, to supplement our expertise. I think it's critical that we do that. I see my time's expired.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
The gentlewoman yields back. Mr. Griffin, you've been very patient. When I say he waved on while not sitting on this subcommittee, we appreciate your coming and welcome you now for 5 minutes to ask your questions.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate you allowing me to weigh onto this committee. Acting Chairman Burkle, I have some brief questions on the furniture tip-over issue, and I want everybody to know I really appreciate what you all are doing. I'm just trying to figure out some things and try to decide what action I should take or not take. But when my now 11-year-old was about 3, he pulled a grandfather or grandmother clock over on him. The good news is he destroyed the clock, but he was fine. A little shaken up, but it was a light enough piece of furniture that it didn't cause him any problems other than, stress Mom and Dad. But I do appreciate what you all are doing in this regard because I do think it's important that we make sure they're safe. So I guess a couple of my questions were, the leading question would be, how did you all arrive at the figure of 60 pounds versus 56 or 62 or 63 as the appropriate test weight to modify the current standard?
I would answer that question, and I would welcome any of my colleagues to answer it as well. But the voluntary standards group, what they were doing was they were basing it on the age, and that's been the discussion of the anthropometric data, that the average weight for a 5-year-old is up to 72 months old, and so that weight is 60 pounds. Some would argue it's even slightly higher. But 60 pounds is where this issue's been stuck for a long period of time.
And is that because after 5 they start to think a little bit better about climbing up on top of stuff? I'm just trying to get the thought process. Anybody can answer.
I think what is happening is that some are looking at where the injuries are occurring, and they're saying, what age group, why don't you focus on those? But I think we've seen some fact patterns most recently where it has kind of enlightened, I'll say, the agency and how staff is looking at this issue. And the question is, will 60 pounds address the hazard, or is it something else that will address the hazard? And I want to reassure this committee that our agency has invested significant funding, and our staff is doing robust testing to help inform us on this issue. In the meantime, as I mentioned earlier, we are taking some steps in the interim to try to make sure that this hazard is addressed.
And is there some data, and obviously it's an ongoing process, but is there some data regarding those who have complied with the voluntary requirement and those who have not, as to whether there are less accidents, more accidents, et cetera?
The agency is, as I mentioned earlier, the agency has put manufacturers on notice that there will be testing to make sure that the current dressers that are out there are compliant with the 2014 standard, because that is a concern we've heard. I know within the industry there are companies that are concerned that not everyone is complying with the standard. It's time that we level the playing field, and I believe that letter to manufacturers will help.
That you sent earlier?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am. But do you have any data as to those that are complying and those that aren't, as to whether there are more injuries or more severe injuries? Or is it anecdotal?
It's anecdotal at this point.
Thanks. Now, you probably already answered this, but because I'm not on the committee and don't hear these issues regularly, I'm just wondering if you can tell me basically what the process would be on this, to establish a mandatory standard. What sort of data would be required, and is there a cost-benefit analysis? Of course, I would have to agree with one of the previous people who said, for saving a child's life, it's hard to do a cost-benefit analysis. But what would be that process for a mandatory requirement?
So it would be onerous to get us to a mandatory standard. As my colleagues mentioned, our Section 7 and Section 9 rulemaking, we have to make those findings. And it's important that the agency does, because what will happen is we'll get overturned in the courts if we don't make that finding. So as we explore possibilities to address this hazard, when I met with Congresswoman Schakowsky, she mentioned it earlier today, the STURDY Act, that a piece of legislation may be a more effective and a quicker way to go.
All right, I appreciate that. I appreciate all of you being here today, and I know it's been a long morning, but it has been very informative, and it's always good to see you, Madam Chair. And I yield back.
Well, that concludes the first panel. I think all members have, how many days? Let's see, I've got that.
We're not up to that.
Hmm?
We're not up
Okay.
to that. You can just read this.
Okay. At this time, I will ask the staff to prepare the witness table, such as we may begin the second panel shortly. We do ask that members may submit questions to you, and I hope that all of you will respond promptly to those inquiries.
Thank you.
So thank you. Appreciate it.
I'll meet you guys in the hall.
okay, leave?
I can't imagine you can move her to the men's room.
Oh, okay.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate
Yeah, thank you. I think you do. Really appreciate you. Okay, I would like to. That would be great.
Have anything to be carried? Thank you.
They, I don't know if this is just
So we will now hear from our second panel. This is kind of the second panel syndrome. Often people, I'm hoping that some will come in and out. Before I introduce everyone, I want to just thank this panel. I want to particularly thank the advocates, without whom I think it would be hard to make the kind of changes that we need. But I also want to say that behind every one of the issues that we're talking about are very brave parents who step forward, often in the midst of very tragic situations, to bring these issues to our attention and turn their pain into power as advocates. And this isn't just about policy. This isn't just about rules and regulations or even budgets. This is about real people. That's what I actually appreciate so much about this committee and this subcommittee. So let me introduce the panel. Rachel Weintraub, who's the Legislative Director and General Counsel for Consumer Federation of America. Mr. Remington Gregg, Counsel for Civil Justice and Consumer Rights at Public Citizen. Mr. Mike Gentine, pronounced correctly, Counsel at Schiff Harden LLP, and Ms. Nancy Coles, Executive Director of Kids in Danger. I want to thank all our witnesses for joining us today. We look forward to your testimony. At this time, the Chair will recognize Ms. Weintraub for 5 minutes to provide her opening statement.
Chairman Schakowsky, Ranking Member McMorris Rogers, and members of the subcommittee, I appreciate the opportunity to provide testimony today. I am Rachel Weintraub, General Counsel and Legislative Director of Consumer Federation of America. CFA is a nonprofit association of approximately 280 pro-consumer groups that was founded in 1968 to advance the consumer interest through advocacy and education. The CPSC's mission impacts every American every day to protect the public from unreasonable risks of death or injury associated with the use of consumer products. This mission relies upon full use of agency authority to issue mandatory standards, assess civil and criminal penalties, work on voluntary standards, and conduct recalls, as well as educating consumers. I'm going to focus my testimony on a number of key product safety issues facing American consumers, but please see my written testimony for my full comments. Decades of deaths and injuries caused by window covering cords and extensive advocacy efforts led to last December's WCMA standard. A recent Pediatrics Journal article reported that approximately 11 children die and 80 suffer near fatal incidents every single year as a result of window cord strangulation. The new version of the window covering voluntary standard requires that window coverings sold as stock or as is must be cordless. This standard should also require that custom products be cordless, and the CPSC must monitor the marketplace for compliance, especially online. CFA's initial research has found inconsistently online with stock products being sold with cords, as well as a lack of consistent warnings. Flame retardants can be found in numerous types of consumer products that have been associated with serious human health problems. CFA and other groups filed a petition urging the agency to adopt mandatory standards to protect consumers from hazards caused by the use of non-polymeric additive form organohalogen flame retardants in children's products, furniture, mattresses, and casings surrounding electronics. While the agency has voted to move forward with our petition and acknowledged that CPSC is clear authority, much be done. On the Internet of Things, the Gardner firm estimated that by the end of 2017, there would be 8.4 billion connected things in use worldwide, of which more than 5 billion would be consumer applications, and that by 2020, this would more than double. The CPSC must lead efforts to address and prevent product safety risks posed by connected products. CPSC's last May's hearing gathered stakeholder input. Commissioner Kaye issued a white paper this year, and we are aware of some interagency activity, but it is not clear what the CPSC is doing and how they are leading in this area. For example, an electronic scooter's Bluetooth module was hacked, and the hacker was able to control the braking and acceleration of the scooter. The CPSC must take enforcement action to protect consumers from this unequivocal product safety hazard. On liquid nicotine, there's been confusion by C about enforcing this important law. At first, the CPSC misinterpreted the start date, delaying application, and then did not include flow restrictors in its 2018 guidance letter to industry. The CPSC has since clarified the law, but we remain concerned about the CPSC's enforcement and the fact that noncompliance, as we saw in the first panel, remain on the market. The CPSC must monitor much more carefully, must take enforcement actions for non-compliant products, and we urge the IOG to investigate the CPSC's delayed and misinterpretation of the law. On electric scooters, the growth of electric scooters and the injuries they cause has been profound. Consumer Reports has identified 1,500 scooter injuries across the country from late 2017, with numerous gaps in data collection and reporting. Again, the CPSC should be leading this effort. The CDC is working with the Austin Public Health Department on an investigation, but the CPSC must do much more. On portable generators, much more needs to be done. On average, there are about 70 deaths and several thousand non-fatal injuries every year associated with CO poisoning from portable generators. We need a mandatory standard, we need compliance, and we need to make sure that fewer people are dying from using portable generators in emergencies. In conclusion, the CPSC plays a critical role in ensuring that consumers are safe from product hazards, and this subcommittee plays an important CPSC oversight role. We look forward to working with the subcommittee and the commission to prevent deaths and injuries from consumer products. Thank you very much.
Let me now call on Mr. Gregg for 5 minutes of testimony.
Good afternoon, Chair Schakowsky, Ranking Member McMorris-Rodgers, and members of the subcommittee. On behalf of Public Citizen and our more than 500,000 members and supporters, thank you for giving me the opportunity to testify. My written testimony explores a wide range of issues, but I'd like to talk to you about 2 areas of concern: removing Section 6B of the Consumer Product Safety Act from law and ensuring robust enforcement of product safety laws. According to a Public Citizen report, the CPSC took an average of 209 days to warn the public about hazardous products in 46 cases from 2002 to 2008, in which the Commission levied fines against the manufacturers. We believe that the Commission took so long to notify the public in part because of the requirements of 6B. 6B restricts the CPSC from publicly disclosing any information from which the public can readily ascertain the identity of a manufacturer or private labeler unless certain criteria are met. The requirement has the effect of stopping or slowing the flow of pertinent information from getting to the public. Withholding information from parents, children, and other users of these products for such an unreasonable amount of time puts our families at risk. The law unnecessarily hamstrings the agency with restrictions that, to our knowledge, and this is key, no other similarly situated government health and safety agency has to endure. The requirements under 6B are outdated, they are anti-consumer. When Congress passed the Consumer Product Safety Improvement Act in 2008, rather than remove 6B from statute, Congress decided to require the CPSC to create saferproducts.gov, and we are pleased that Congress did that. It's clear that saferproducts.gov has become a critical tool for protecting consumers from potential hazards and helps to close the time gap between the manufacturer learning of a hazard and the information actually reaching consumers. But what was clear a decade ago is even clearer today. Section 6B restrains the CPSC in its ability to proactively disclose safety hazards to the public. There isn't a lot of 6B case law, but what is out there shows that companies have used it not to ensure that accurate information is out in the public domain, but to delay critical information from being released. There is a very big difference between correcting objectively inaccurate information and simply delaying or killing the release of information that could be potentially damaging to the company's bottom line. Congress should ask itself, what is the point of 6B? Does it now, or has it ever, helped the agency effectively carry out its mission to keep products that have the potential to injure or cause death out of the marketplace? And if not, why keep it around? Why give industry insiders and corporate America the reins to legislating? In terms of criminal and civil penalties at the agency, there is now a disinclination to place the safety of consumers over industry loyalty and a steady decrease in the number of penalties imposed on corporate bad actors. Criminal and civil penalties serve as an important tool to discourage companies from cutting corners when manufacturing products, and they also create an incentive to ensure that manufacturers quickly report product defects. The data clearly suggests that Commission leadership is prepared to continue a less enforcement is best attitude. We urge the Commission to make it clear, Congress, to make it clear that the agency, that its mission is to protect the public from unreasonable injury or death, and it requires the Commission to promulgate robust rules to protect consumers and hold corporate wrongdoers accountable, with strong penalties that serve as an effective deterrent. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
The gentleman yields back, and now I'm happy to give 5 minutes for an opening statement to Mr. Gentine.
Thank you very much, Chair Schakowsky, Ranking Member McMorris Rogers, and members. Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to appear before you today. Thank you as well for holding this hearing to talk about the vital work of the Consumer Product Safety Commission. First, I should note that I'm appearing in my personal capacity. My opinions are my own, may not represent those of any previous or current former employer or client. I am honored to share this panel with 3 tireless consumer advocates, each of whom I have come to know and respect, even though we may sometimes disagree about how we pursue our shared goal of advancing consumer safety. I've also had the privilege of working alongside many of the talented, dedicated staff at CPSC who devote their lives to protecting consumers. Every officer and employee of the CPSC is a public servant in the truest sense of that term, and they all deserve our thanks. The notice for this hearing asks a simple question: is the Consumer Product Safety Commission fulfilling its mission? From my perspective, the answer is equally simple: yes. As you know, CPSC is charged with protecting against unreasonable risks of injury associated with consumer products. Since 1972, CPSC has worked alongside the consumer products industry to fulfill that mission. Most of that work goes unnoticed. From thousands of incident reports to hundreds of recalls to dozens of standards, CPSC is continuously engaged in a variety of efforts that most consumers never see, but that benefit every consumer. The third of these activities, working on standards bodies, has been criticized of late, and I fear that criticism comes from some misunderstandings about the role that voluntary consensus standards play. First, while they are legally voluntary standards, myriad influences drive manufacturers toward compliance. These include retailers who demand certification for shelf space, and CPSC staff and civil courts who use voluntary consensus standards in defect determinations. Second, they are consensus standards. They are the products of collaboration between all interested stakeholders, including CPSC staff whose opinions carry great weight. Indeed, consensus standards can be more collaborative than rulemaking. By the time an agency issues an NPR, much of its thinking is developed, if not cemented. Voluntary consensus standards start with collaboration. The consensus bodies also offer safety advantages. They're a force multiplier for CPSC staff. They're made up of product-specific experts, and they're better able to adapt to developing hazards and emerging innovation. CPSC also has tools to make these nominally voluntary standards more mandatory. It can give standards for durable infant and toddler products the same effect as mandatory rules. It can rely on a standard, creating a reporting obligation for non-compliant companies, and it can force recalls or prevent importation of products whose readily observable characteristics show they do not comply with a standard. With these tools, CPSC can use voluntary consensus standards to provide a safer, more level playing field, rather than one that slants in favor of the non-compliant company. As with the voluntary consensus standards process, the information disclosure provisions of Section 6 of the CPSA have been criticized of late, but that criticism ignores 3 key principles. First, Section 6 creates process requirements. It does not prescribe or proscribe any outcome. Second, it asks CPSC to take reasonable steps to ensure the fairness and accuracy of its disclosures. Why would we want the agency to do anything else? And third, CPSC has multiple vehicles consistent with due process that allow it to either shorten or eliminate the modest time these steps require. Some point out that other agencies are not subject to the same restrictions. This is a half-truth. Other agencies also do not have the same access to information. Section 6 assures companies that CPSC will handle carefully information that other agencies never receive. That assurance enables candid discussions that better inform CPSC staff. Without it, those conversations would be more limited and consumers would be less safe. There are areas in which I believe the agency can improve. First, for an example, and as raised by Congresswoman Matsui, I agree with the industry and consumer advocate consensus that CPSC should adopt California's Technical Bulletin 117. This flammability standard has proven effective, and manufacturers can meet it without the use of chemical flame retardants. Second, CPSC's import surveillance program can only physically surveil a handful of ports. The agency needs data tools that can more reliably distinguish between higher risk and known compliant products before their arrival. And third, CPSC's fast-track voluntary recall program should recover its speed, as some recalls are taking months for approval. CPSC must, of course, do its due diligence, but it is not in anyone's best interest if staffing constraints unnecessarily impede companies whose sole aim is to act swiftly to protect consumers. I began with two assertions, that CPSC is fulfilling its mission and that its successes come from the public service of the talented, dedicated people who make up the agency. I believe strongly in both. While the agency should always seek to improve, consumers can draw comfort from their faithful watchdog in Bethesda. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back, and now I welcome Ms. Coles for 5 minutes for her opening statement.
Thank you. Is this on? Yeah. Thank you, Chairman Schakowsky, Ranking Member McMorris Rogers, and subcommittee members for this opportunity to testify before you about the CPSC's mission. KIDS, a nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting children by fighting for product safety. We were founded in 1998 by two Chicago parents whose son Danny was killed in a poorly designed and untested portable crib. As Danny's mother foresaw when she testified before a House subcommittee in 2004, improved children's product safety will be Danny's legacy. Last month, we released our report on 2018 recalls. We found that the number of recalls overall was the lowest since 2003, and the number of children's products recalls, as well as the units of children's products recalled, were the lowest since we started tracking in 2001. It is tricky to say whether low recall numbers are a good thing, pointing to safer products, or a sign of lax enforcement, leaving dangerous products on store shelves and in our homes. Indicators this year, such as other less effective actions in lieu of recalls, make us worry that now it is the latter. After filing suit last year for a recall of the Bob strollers with almost 100 injuries, CPSC settled for an information campaign that is explicitly not a recall and lasts only 1 year. Unlike recalled products, these Bob jogging strollers can be legally sold in the secondhand market, meaning we will see continuing injuries. KID has also looked at recall effectiveness numbers reported by recalling companies to CPSC each year. For this year's report, we were unable to get that data due to a lack of response from the CPSC's FOIA office. But according to the CPSC, in the hearing that was held, that number is under 10%. One example is the 2016 recall of IKEA dressers. Publicly available information shows that fewer than 2% of these dressers have been returned to IKEA for a refund. IKEA has focused their messaging almost exclusively on anchoring the dressers rather than returning them for a refund and getting them out of homes. Every 10 days, a child dies when a dresser or other furniture tips over on them and crushes them. Every 18 minutes, a family rushes a child to the emergency room for that same hazard. There's no federal standard to stop manufacturers from making unstable furniture. The voluntary ASTM standard lags behind the evidence that all of these incidents provide. Industry has been dragging their feet for years, and children are paying the price. Several families whose children were killed by furniture and TV tip-overs have joined together to form PAT, Parents Against Tip-Overs. The group participates in the voluntary standard settings, has met with CPSC leadership, and I dare say will be in to see each of you if they haven't already. As Lisa Seifert of Barrington, Illinois said when she joined KID last month to announce support for legislation on this issue, if action had been taken when her son Shane was killed 7 years ago, these other families could be home with their children now. An effective standard would include all storage units, and testing protocol would represent all children under 72 months and include tests to account for real-world use. We also need that strong standard to be mandatory so that every family can be sure that the furniture they purchase is stable. We support the Sturdy Act to achieve this goal. We've heard about 6B. I will just say parents should not have to wait on the manufacturer's timetable before learning that their child is sleeping in a deadly crib, playing with a lead-tainted toy, or riding in a stroller prone to losing a wheel. Section 6B should be repealed, or at the very least, more should be done to weaken its negative impact on safety. Through the implementation of Section 104, or Danny's Law, of the CPSIA, CPSC has successfully implemented strong mandatory standards for 20 types of durable infant and toddler products. 5 from the original list remain, however, either that they have been passed but the effective date has not been reached, or they are still pending. But last year was CPSIA's 10th anniversary. More than a decade after passage of this landmark legislation, consumers still have no assurance that all nursery products are tested for safety before they reach store shelves. We believe just as standards evolve as new designs introduce potential hazards, the group of products covered by Danny's Law should also evolve as new products enter the market. Among children's product safety issues, a safe sleep environment is an overriding concern. Suffocation, most of it in a sleeping environment, is the leading cause of unintentional death in infants. The number of sleep-related deaths in infants is a public health emergency. We heard this from this week's warning on Fisher-Price Rock and Play that these products carry risk of suffocation and death. Consumer Reports released an article documenting the additional hazard of positional asphyxia in younger babies that was not in CPSC's warning. This products and other that pose the same hazard should be recalled. Again, thank you for allowing me to testify today. We appreciate the attention and oversight that your committee is bringing to these important issues.
Thank you all for your important testimony. I want to just say a special thank you to Commissioner Adler and Commissioner Baiocco. Thank you for staying for the testimony of panel 2. No, I understand you have other things to do, but I'm very happy that you were and are here. So now we will turn to our members for 5 minutes, and of questions, and I will begin. It's so tempting, and I think I will go to that to look at some of these particular incidents that are now threatening our children, and I do want to see if we could get answers that deal with the item, for example, of furniture tip-overs, but also how that reflects on the commission and how we can improve. You know, right now the CPSC launched the Anchor It campaign in 2011 to explain to parents why they need to anchor the furniture against the wall. So we're now talking about a 11-year effort to reduce the number of deaths, and as was pointed out, they continue, and the injuries continue at a rapid pace. So it seems to me that, first of all, this idea of anchoring, if you're a renter and you are told, put a hole in the wall so that you can anchor that dresser. Some will say, absolutely not, because I want my down payment on the apartment, and I'm not going to put a hole in the wall. That's ineffective. But how can we allow an 8-year problem, or maybe even more, to go on with these furniture tip-overs? Anyone who wants to answer? Ms. Coles.
Yes, I'll start on that. We work very hard on this issue. We have participated in the ASTM furniture subcommittee, which I have to say, I work on a lot of ASTM committees. They're all a little bit frustrating for the consumer advocates, but this one in particular, there's just been stonewalling of progress in that committee. We support the Anchor It campaign. There is a need right now, because furniture is unstable, for parents to consider and look at ways to make sure that they have stable furniture, and one of those is anchoring. But the long-term solution is to make stable furniture. There are ways to do this. We work with university students who have some great designs that cannot tip over. They're as effective as a strap holding it to the wall. We appreciate the comments made by Chairman Burkle recently, saying that she would enforce the voluntary standard, saying that calling for additional weight in the testing. That one in particular is probably getting stuck right now in the ASTM committee.
Not only weight, but aren't we going to have a test where the kids' weights are actually...
That was not part of her commitment at this point. We certainly look for that in the future. That's what's going to be necessary to do. But in terms of enforcement, in 2016, Kids and Chains Foundation did research. We found non-compliant dressers, as did CPSC that same year. Consumer Reports last year. This statement that was made in February, we still see very few. We've seen no furniture recalls in the past year and 3 months of this year. So it's okay to talk, but we need to start seeing action on this, because again, just picture every 10 days a child is dying, and the number of that group in PAT is just growing, and they don't want their core to grow.
Ms. Weintraub, you mentioned a whole bunch of different things that we need to do at the CPSC. How come it's taken so long to address them?
I think that's a great question, and there's many factors to it. I think you need political will. I think the agency needs to use the tools at their disposal. Based on the safety hierarchy, warnings are the weakest thing we could do. We need the rock and play to be recalled. We need the BRETAX to be recalled. We need civil penalties that are meaningful and not merely a cost of doing business. And with the voluntary standards, CPSC by statute relies on voluntary standards, but those process, while they may meet the technical definitions of consensus, they vary widely. And as Nancy mentioned, it is a very difficult process. There are few consumers. Sometimes the standard is already completely baked when consumers have any access to it. There's many issues, and I think 6B is one that pervades everything. There is the rule itself, which I think Mr. Gentine outlined some of those things, but there is also the culture. The culture of 6B and the shadow of 6B is so vast that it impacts everything the agency does and gives companies negotiating with the agency huge amounts of power, and ultimately consumers suffer as a result.
Thank you. Boy, 5 minutes just goes rushing by. I'm going to yield now to the ranking member who says it's okay to just say Ms. Rogers.
Okay.
There we go. New improved. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate everyone being here and sharing testimony today. I wanted to start with Mr. Gentine, and from your testimony, it's clear that you're a proponent of voluntary standards. Can you please explain why they help protect consumers?
I think from the outset, the first is simply a matter of scale. CPSC in this current fiscal year is engaged in 76 different voluntary standards activities on top of their mandatory rulemakings, on top of recalls, et cetera. There's simply no way. I know we've talked a lot about CPSC's budget, and I would join the chorus to say that it should be a bit higher. But a CPSC that was big enough to engage directly in all of those issues, some of which are more on the level of monitoring and looking for continuous improvement, would be a CPSC that carries an awfully large price tag and frankly would be intrusive in ways that I don't believe it's intended to be. It's intended to be a partner with industry, with consumers, with advocates in building a safer consumer products market. So I think, for one, just a matter of economy or staffing realities, that CPSC cannot get into all of those issues. But beyond that, I think the fact that they're closer to the individual products at issue is key for me. The standards bodies, as Ms. Culls mentioned, have engineers on them who have designed and worked on those products, those specific products, their entire career. CPSC, 550 people, a fraction of those are engineers. They have to be generalists. They do not have the luxury of focusing their careers on one product. So I think there's a greater expertise and again, a staff multiplying effect that's vital for consumers.
Thank you. How old is the oldest open rule on CPSC's agenda? And should the Commission consider cleaning up the docket moving forward?
To answer those, I suppose in reverse, one, CPSC definitely should. There are rules that have been around for a while, and I can't confidently assert that it's the oldest, but the oldest one I'm aware of is the open rulemaking on upholstered furniture flammability. The NPR in that was issued actually shortly before a certain Mr. Simpson took a ride in a white Bronco. So it's now of legal drinking age, which I suppose is a good thing for an NPR. I'm not sure. So I think the reality that drives home is that CPSC has been in this issue for a while and hasn't come to a conclusion. And I take Commissioner Adler's point that there are some process issues about adopting California's standard. I think they can be overcome, and more importantly, I think they should be overcome. Staff has some reservations about that, but I think the opportunity exists to lock in what we already have, which is a very good standard from California, and then pursue whatever is left.
Okay, another question on Section 6B, which we've talked about some this morning. It's been characterized by some as a kind of gag order. Would you speak to that description and why the procedures laid out in Section 6B are important for consumers?
Sure, and I think one thing I would take issue with is the notion that it's somehow there's a power for companies in that. There really isn't much power, because the only enforcement mechanism prior to a commission statement is a willingness to litigate against CPSC in open court, and we don't see a lot of that for very good reasons. There is no post-statement enforcement mechanism beyond requiring CPSC to correct any inaccuracy. There's no mechanism for a company to get any kind of redress for what is simply a process violation. So I think, there's a nuance to this issue that has been cast aside. And again, it's important because, as Ms. Coles talked about, the difference between the number of recalls and the number of reports, that's there for a reason. That was a deliberate choice by Congress to set a reporting threshold that's very, very low, much lower than a recall threshold. As a result of that, especially as companies take CPSC's message and when in doubt report, that means CPSC is getting a lot of information that would not form the basis of a recall. And I'm not sure how it's in consumers' best interest to flood the market with even more ostensibly safety-related messages that don't have any concrete action to them and frankly may not have a basis in reality.
The title of today's hearing is Consumer Product Safety Commission is the Consumer Product Safety Commission fulfilling its mission? You answered yes. Would you just elaborate a little bit more on why you believe that to be the case?
Certainly, and I keep going back to my good friend Commissioner Adler, who's got probably the longest running perspective on this agency, and as he pointed out, there have been dramatic reductions in all sorts of deaths and injuries, and some of that is the direct result of the Commission's actions, but more of it is the way the Commission has engaged with industry, with consumer stakeholders, to bring attention to issues and to address them where they can be addressed through design or manufacturing. So I think, frankly, those numbers speak for themselves, and of course there is more to be done. There will always be more to be done. Perfect is not attainable, but the fact that we haven't gotten to an unattainable state does not mean CPSC isn't fulfilling its mission, and I think it is.
Thank you. I yield back.
And I now call on Mr. McNerney for 5 minutes.
Well, I thank the chairwoman, and I thank the panelists. You'll notice I'm wearing pink today. I wanted to show my softer side, so we shouldn't have any troubles. First of all, on recalls don't do any good if people don't know about it, if they're not able to, or don't know about or don't want to, don't have any way to get their product recalled. So, Mrs. Weintraub and Mrs. Krause, your groups participated in a recall effectiveness workshop in 2017. Now that it's 2 years later, have there been any improvements?
Not that we have seen concretely. The notes were publicized, which took a while to happen, but unfortunately, there are fewer recalls. There are more announcements about products that we think should be recalled, but that aren't. I think a key principle about recall effectiveness, and we have to call an enforcement action a recall. That triggers consumers knowing more about it. If something is a recall or if something is an education campaign, a lot of people aren't going to find out about it. So at a minimum, it needs to be called a recall, and both the CPSC and manufacturers need to do everything they can to communicate that information to consumers, and we know that that's not happening, especially due to Nancy's great report.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. So not only did we see the number of recalls go down last year, we saw CPSC came to Facebook in 2017 and reported 75% of the recalls on their Facebook page. And social media isn't the panacea. It's not the total answer, but it shows an intent. Certainly consumers follow it. Last year, that dropped to 45%. So they're already dropping back from the one tool that they added to their arsenal. And actually, I mentioned Linda was here in 2004, and she said something that's still true today. These companies know exactly how to reach us when they're trying to sell us a product. They need to use those very same tools when they're trying to get the product out of the market. That means marketing. Rachel worked hard to try and get marketing experts for CPSC to invite to that hearing. They were not invited. there are tools. These are companies that do great outreach to consumers. They know how to reach us. They could get these products back if it was a priority of both theirs and the agency's.
Does the agency have the tools to compel these businesses to use their resources to publicize recalls?
Well, that's the issue, right? And Chairman Burkle alluded to it earlier when she said it was better to take this very sad action with BRETAX that really does nothing to make consumers whole than to keep fighting for a recall when a company doesn't want to do it. The companies are really in the driving seat with a recall. They edit the press release. They determine what they're willing to do. One of the rules that is pending would put into place mandatory things that would have to be done for every recall, and that has just not gone anywhere. And so, unfortunately, there is just not enough pressure on companies to reach some number above 10% of the products recalled.
Okay. Mr. Gregg, what are some actions that the agency could take to get information out about recalls?
Well, I think that one important next step would be to get that chief technologist or experts who actually know more about technology. In the previous administration, I worked at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, and that was one of the big things we did, which was to try to ensure greater use of technology to reach the whole of the American people, as well as making government better. And right now what we're seeing is just an inability to do that. And you can do, there are things that can be done. Just think about what we use with our phone right now. We use it for everything. And you could use it when you go and buy something, and you could use the barcode, and you could scan it, and you would know, and the company would know all of your information, and as soon as there was a recall, could push out a notification. There's been a recall. That can be done. Now, do we want that to be done? That's probably the decision and policy question that we have to grapple with, but the technology is out there, which is the important point, and the agency needs to lead into it.
Well, I mean, one of the deterrents of bad products is that you get put on a recall, and then customers they're going to be more cautious about your products. So the companies are going to naturally resist this.
And that's what they're doing right now, yeah.
Okay, moving on a little bit. Emergency rooms are monitored for product safety, but what about urgent care centers and other avenues that people go to that aren't being monitored that could be monitored?
So that's true. Currently, the CPSC has a system called NICE. It is a representative sample of 100 hospitals, and for those selected hospitals, they intake product safety incident information, and CPSC then makes national estimates. And as of now, the NICE system does not include urgent care centers. However, I would say that the NICE system is one of the best systems, even with limitations that we have. CDC relies on it. Other countries use it as a model. So while it could definitely be improved, it's imperative that it remain in effect, as it's a very important source of safety information.
Okay, I'll kneel back.
And I thought I heard Acting Commissioner Chairman Burkle say that she wanted to include urgent care data going forward. So hopefully we can help make that happen. Mr. Bouchant, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'm going to start out by saying I think I'm going to go by the assumption that over 500 employees and the commissioners at the agency are on all of our sides trying to do the best they can to make sure that consumers are safe, as you are too. So from basing it from that, sometimes I think we make the assumption there's nefarious activity here, and I think a lot of times it has to do with legal and sometimes legal barriers and policy differences that we need to debate, and that's why this hearing is so important. Quickly, Mr. Gregg, in your written testimony, you said an average of 209 days to warn the public and 46 cases between 2002 and 2008. I was just interested in what is the start date for the average, because if it's from the initial complaint to the CPSC, or is it from when it's determined to be valid complaint, or is it when the fine is levied? Because I think that's important, because the reason is, let me just say, is because I think it's a long time, it seems like, on the face of it, but the reality is that, you know, from a competitive standpoint, if all you had to do was complain to the agency about your competitor's product and they sent out a warning, you know, I'm just using an extreme example. So what is, kind of in short, what is that time, what's the start date on that?
That would be from when the agent, I'll double check, but I'm almost positive it's from the date that the agency gets gets warning that there's something afoot that they need to look into.
Okay, so that's what I'm trying to clarify, because, I mean, you could send a warning, right, about a product, or anyone could send a warning. And so I think it's important to as in the context of Section 6B, I guess, you know, it's important to make sure that they're valid, and then we move as quickly as possible to get that warning out to the consumers.
The one thing I would add to that, which I just wanted to ensure we get on the record, the policy, legal and policy discussions are important. You know, the Supreme Court has interpreted 6B to be for that FOIA is included in 6B. So again, that's something that this agency has that no other agency has, where, for example, information can't go into the public in the FOIA context. So we can have that discussion, but it's hamstring in other ways too.
I get that. Mr. Gentine, do you think the CPSC could ever handle implementing mandatory standards for every product under their jurisdiction?
No. No, as a matter of scale and frankly, you know, in a lot of situations, we've talked today about some voluntary standards that people believe need improvement, and certainly every standard, every rule, every human activity can always be improved. But there are a lot of voluntary standards covering products within CPSC's jurisdiction that, aside from sort of regular cyclical review, aren't ever at issue because they're working very well and they're keeping those products, keeping those consumers safe. So I don't think CPSC ever could issue rules to cover all 15,000 products in its jurisdiction, and I don't think it should, even if it were possible.
I mean, it doesn't seem practical, at least with the current staffing levels, to make that happen. I think you commented that to try to do something like that would just massively expand the staffing levels and the money required to
correct, and
do that. When it sounds like, from what you just said, that in most cases voluntary standards are being complied with.
Correct, and
not always,
where,
but many times.
Where there are gaps, you know, that's what CPSC is there to do, to help fill the gaps one way or another.
Yeah. And again, can you just reiterate again? You may already comment on this a little bit, like the top 3 areas where you think maybe there can be some improvement at the CPSC.
Sure. One of them.
I think this is an important point. That's why I want you to kind of reiterate it again.
Certainly. One of them I did mention was TB 117, the upholstered furniture flammability standard. One that's in my written comments but didn't, you know, meet the 5-minute cut was on the question of tip over. Again, there are certainly open questions about the adequacy of that standard and how its testing works, but I think at a minimum to take that standard and make it mandatory would at least help ensure that non-compliant products aren't getting in, and then we can talk about moving the standard forward. And I think, again, we come back to resource constraints. I say I don't want a CPSC big enough to write rules on all 15,000 of its products, but I think a CPSC with more robust resources than it has now that would allow it to get into more data and technology issues and would allow it to speed recalls along, I think would benefit everyone.
Yeah, I mean, I think particularly as it relates to children, you know, because obviously they can't report that my crib isn't working properly, right? So, I mean, in that respect, you know, you could create a prioritization of what things should be mandatory, maybe, and voluntary, and kind of prioritize what things are the most at risk for the consumers, particularly children.
Certainly. Thank you.
Yeah. Now you go back.
Well, that completes our second panel. I want to thank you all so very much. I wanted to make a comment, and if you would like to, Ranking Member, also. One of the takeaways that I have that seems pretty unanimous is that the Consumer Product Safety Commission needs more resources. And I hope we're thinking big. When I think about all the problems that and the dangers that are out there that are under the jurisdiction of the Consumer Product Safety Commission, we have an agency that started small, and all we've had are sort of incremental increases that pretty much relative to other agencies keep it small. And so I hope we can be bold in our thinking about and begin with what does the Consumer Product Safety Commission really need to be effective in handling all that's under its jurisdiction and go for that kind of increase, and perhaps authorities that would make it a more effective agency, because it's so important. And I yield to the ranking member if you want to make any comments.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. And I too want to say thanks again to everyone who testified, the consumer advocates, as well as the commissioners for being here today. It's great to see all of the positions filled on the Consumer Product Safety Commission. I am hopeful that we will see Anne-Marie Burkle confirmed shortly in the Senate so that we can continue to move forward on addressing these important issues. And I, too, would acknowledge that there was broad agreement that there needed to be more support, more resources, more funding for the Commission in order for them to continue to do the good work that they are doing. And I look forward to working with everyone to make sure that this Commission is doing everything possible to protect our consumers, our families, our children, and from the many, many products that are out there. And thank you again for this hearing.
Thank you. I would like unanimous consent to enter into the record and the following documents: a letter from the Electronic Privacy Information Center, a letter from CPSC Acting Chair Anne-Marie Burkle, to ASTM International, a letter from the National Association of Manufacturers. I seek unanimous consent. Without objection, they are entered into the record, and the committee hearing is, oh, wait, let's see. I do want to again thank the witnesses for their participation in today's hearing. I remind members, there you are, members, that pursuant to committee rules, you have 10 days, business days, to submit additional questions for the record to be answered by witnesses who have appeared. I ask each witness, as I did earlier, to please respond promptly to any such questions that you may receive at this time. The subcommittee is adjourned.
Very good.